I want to make it clear that it is the purpose of the nation to build now with all possible speed every machine, every arsenal, every factory that we need to manufacture our defense material. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
This is what American industry, and particularly...
Good morning and welcome to the Arsenal of Democracy's 75th World War II Victory Commemoration Flyover. I'm Matt Jolly from HistoryWorthSaving.com, and I'll be with you for the next 90 minutes as we prepare for this stirring tribute to the men and women who helped defend democracy and defeat the forces of oppression and tyranny 3/4 of a century ago. It's difficult to exaggerate the enormity of World War II, not just the monumental cost in money and lives, but also the all-consuming nature of a conflict that involved so many different people from so many different countries for 6 long years. For most of us, it's also hard to understand just how focused and united Americans were on winning the war. For 4 years, people put their lives on hold as they focused their attention, energy, and resources on defeating the Axis aggressors. Now, nearly 8 decades later, for those who see the war in hindsight, it seems that victory was always inevitable, that good was always destined to triumph over evil. But that's not what it felt like to those living through the disappointments, deprivations, and sacrifices of World War II. So all these years later, as we observe the 75th anniversary of the Allied victory in 1945, we thought it would be appropriate to commemorate that historic achievement and thank the men and women who made it possible. But before we turn our focus to that war effort, we'd like to take a minute to thank the organizations whose support has helped to make today's flyover possible. The Bob Hope Legacy, a part of the Bob and Dolores Hope Foundation, contributed very generously to today's event, in large part to help, thank, and commemorate the contributions of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who helped to achieve victory. Today's flyover has also benefited from a grant made by the U.S. Department of Defense. Other organizations who provided much-needed support to the Arsenal of Democracy flyover include Bombardier Aviation, Jet Aviation, a division of General Dynamics Company, Garmin, the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, Hartzell Propeller, Federal Express, Signature Flight Support, the George Washington University, Veterans Airlift Command, and Mach 2 Management. Thanks to all of them, today's event could not have happened without them. As the veterans of World War II have grown older and the memories of all that they achieved grow more distant, we have come to put even higher value on first-hand accounts of the men who went to war to defend their country. All of these veterans are now well into their 90s. Some have lived more than a century, but their ability to enthrall us with their stories and reflections of the war have only improved with age. Veterans organizations, schools, and community groups invite these individuals to share their stories because the sacrifices they made and the challenges they face have come into sharper focus with time. Our collective appreciation for all that they accomplish has grown steadily stronger. And we now know that the storytelling can't go on forever, that our access to their first-hand recollections will soon end. And so, as the aircraft participating in today's Arsenal of Democracy flyover continue to prepare for today's big event, we'd like to share with you some of what these veterans remember from their experiences in the greatest armed conflict in human history.
War had always been contested, on land and at sea. But by the 1930s, it was clear that the airplane was going to change that forever.
Modern warfare will be fought as much in the air as on the ground.
Well, the Americans are going to develop a new form of warfare, and that's what it was, a new form of warfare. And the idea was, why don't we develop an air force that can obviate the necessity for ground warfare? We'll fly over the standing armies to the industrial targets inside enemy territory and immobilize the war machine that makes warfare possible. So it's a very different way of fighting a war. Now, what they had was a theory, and they needed a delivering instrument.
The Boeing company had been designing just such a plane, the B-17. It was the first four-engine bomber capable of penetrating deep into enemy territory and returning.
The B-17 was a miracle plane as far as the Air Force was concerned. It was faster, it was sturdier, and it had more firepower than anything that the Air Force had envisioned. It's bristling with machine guns. It's about as fast as any fighter at the time. In addition to that, it's a delivering instrument for tremendous numbers of bombs.
With war in Europe looming, the Army Air Corps had ordered only 13 B-17s, the plane they called the Flying Fortress.
Poland, September 1939. The German foe begins its ruthless march of conquest and sets the stage for World War II.
Germany had established a massive military force with troops, tanks, and artillery. And in secret, they had built the Luftwaffe, the first modern air force with some of the most advanced aircraft ever built.
The air ministries in London and in Washington were suddenly awakened to the fact, oh my God, are we ready? Are we prepared? So the first shock to the system is actually a defensive shock. Can we get ready?
American President Franklin Roosevelt was caught between the reality of German aggression and American public opinion.
This time America should keep out, and I know I will. Avoid all foreign entanglement. I think we should stay out of it entirely. Let Europe fight our own battles. They mean nothing to us.
He has a Congress that doesn't want to talk about war, and a public which has said to itself, World War I, that was the war to end all wars. We're not going to go back to war again.
But the threat became even more ominous as Germany unleashed its blitzkrieg on Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, and France, and they all fell, leaving only the United Kingdom unconquered.
The thing that would really ultimately touched Roosevelt's worldview was the threat that if Britain fell, that the Royal Navy would become a tool for Hitler's imperialism. And if that happened, if Hitler lands 5 divisions on our eastern seaboard, he can go all the way from the Alleghenies to the Rockies. There's nothing we can do to stop them. How is he going to be able to ramp this country up to fight a war that it had never fought before? Mechanized warfare, air power. He has no defense industry. They'd all been dismantled after World War I. The only option he had was to go to American business, the people who knew about production and knew about how you would be able to produce these kinds of new weapons of war, even if they'd never made them before, and to get them involved in the process.
I want to make it clear that it is the purpose of the nation to build now with all possible speed every machine, every arsenal, every factory that we need to manufacture our defense material. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
This is what American industry, and particularly the automobile industry and the aviation industry, would become: an arsenal of democracy to arm the Allies and also arm ourselves if war really came.
Roosevelt called for America to build 50,000 airplanes.
50,000 American airplanes. People thought he was crazy, 50,000 planes. We only had an air force of 1,200 planes, and we had the 16th largest army in the world, right behind Romania. So we're not ready. Troops are out there training with broomsticks. We have more horses than we have tanks. We're just not ready for this thing.
To support the British and to prepare to defend the United States meant that America would wage a war of mass production. A bitterly competitive U.S. aircraft industry with rivals like Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed would have to build each other's planes to meet the call to arm America and its allies.
This was an unprecedented direction for American aviation companies. These were competitors for government contracts, for commercial contracts, but the war effort drew those companies together in ways that really hadn't happened before. Unprecedented cooperation.
The orders were so large, 12,000 for the B-17 alone, that it transformed Boeing and all of American aviation from a collection of businesses into an industry. Aircraft, once produced by hand, now rolled off assembly lines. Huge modern factories sprang up across the country. Tens of thousands of workers were recruited, hired, and trained. And the number of plants only grew after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. After America entered the war, anyone who was of age was a soldier or a worker.
It's as if an entire country stops and does nothing that isn't related to warfare.
It's around-the-clock production. The lights never go out. The machines never stop.
We had 3 shifts at the factory that I was at. 8 hours each, 3 different shifts, 24 hours a day. We in engineering slept at the factory 5 nights a week. We had rooms, we had a restaurant, and we went home Saturday night and Sunday night so we could see our girlfriends.
You had women who had never worked in a factory before, and yet by the war's end, 1 out of every 3 workers was a woman.
My sister and I worked together, and we see people getting dressed to go out, and we couldn't. We had to go to work. And if we didn't feel like going to work, we had this record of Rosie the Riveter.
She's making history, working for victory, Rosie the Riveter.
And we'd wind that up and play that, and that boosted our morale, so we said, oh, okay, we gotta go. Let's go. We wanted to get in there and be a part of it.
It was an incredible situation. The airplanes were coming out 8, 10, 12, 15 every day.
But as a lot of them discovered, an industrial plant is a dangerous place. And it's an astonishing fact, but true, that in 1942, let's remember the year of Guadalcanal, it's the year of Midway, it's the year of the War of the Atlantic, that in 1942, more Americans were killed and injured in war-related industries than were killed or wounded in uniform by a factor of 20 to 1. When we think about the sacrifice that was being made as part of that flat-out war effort, we begin to realize just how much The people working in those plants were just as much a part of that greatest generation as the men who landed at Iwo Jima or at Normandy, who flew over the skies of Germany and Japan.
The thousands of planes that rolled out of plants in every part of the country were designed and built to execute the doctrine of strategic bombardment, bomb the enemy's military and industrial base, and bring his war machine to a halt. That was the theory.
High-altitude strategic bombing can knock the enemy's industrial machine out to the point where it can't fight the war any longer. So you need armadas, if you will, of bombers to attack these targets. Because on some days, you're going to hit 2, 3 targets, maybe 4, simultaneously. And you take some losses. So you have to have almost a pipeline, if you will, bringing planes into Great Britain throughout the war.
These vast fleets of British and American bombers had been anticipated in the futuristic literature of the 1920s and the 1930s. The air was dark, as they would say in the novels, with bombers raining down death from the air. And yet now something like that was true.
All the day long, where the rain has shined, she's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the riveter, keeps the sharp.
World War II was underway when Connie Palacios was 18 and just out of high school. She took a job as a riveter at the Boeing Wichita Aircraft Factory. She was one of the original Rosie the Riveters. She is in her mid-90s now and just as sharp and snappy as she was when she was putting rivets in the very first B-29 to roll off the assembly line.
And then they sent me to a school there in Wichita. And they had a school there. They sent me there because they needed riveters. The first day I was there, I didn't rivet. Kind of a little disappointing to me, but the reason I didn't was that the last B-17 was being, they were building in there, but they were going to finish it. And the next day they were going to start with the B-29. They asked me to rivet, but they said, well, we don't have any buckers. We only have one person, but nobody wanted to work with her because she was a black girl. And because in those days they were very prejudiced. Well, I said, I don't mind working with her because I'm a minority too, because I am of Mexican descent. So they said, are you sure? Yes, I'll work with her. So she became my partner, and I tell you, she was the best bucker. And if it hadn't been for her, I couldn't have riveted like I did. And then, of course, the Japanese also had Tokyo Rose. And she was always on the radio, and she was trying to break the morale of the boys. So that's why we started calling us Rosie, the Riveter, because we were, well, it would make us so angry. And so all us women, we tried to work harder so we can get those planes out of there so we can get to Japan. Well, it's a better life, I tell you, because we don't have the prejudice we used to have. And everybody is treated more equal, you know, and it's a great place to live, America, because I've been in foreign countries. I went to Venezuela to help build a church in '97, and I tell you, there's nothing like the United States. So I am very proud to be an American citizen, that I was born in the United States.
We'd like to tell you something about our department, 61 Department, the Air Force. When an Airacobra rolls off the assembly line, it isn't finished. No, sir, not by a long shot. There are still some 304 different operations to be done, and it's our department that does them. Our territory starts with the ramp at the end of the plant. Then we have the pre-flight hangar and the combat hangar just in front of it. We use them to check the airplanes before their first takeoff. Then there's the recheck hangar where the bugs are ironed out after the initial flight. And of course, we use the modifications hangar for final work. It's an around-the-clock job, and we've got over 1,000 people working the 3 shifts. Altogether, we put in more than 250,000 man-hours every month. How's it all kept track of? Well, it's kind of simple. You see, there's an airport operations office up in the mezzanine. Vivian Pollard gets a call every time an airplane is moved, and she tells Corrine Shipston, who keeps the control board up to the minute. In addition, there's a big map of the airport, too, kept up by Jean Sekula and Betty Bowery. First of all, we put an airplane through flow test and pressure test. Here's Maury Goldstein checking the pressure. If it's okay, Doris Goodenough, the inspector, puts plenty of muscle on the stamp that sends the ship on to engine test. At engine test, a man has to be quick and sure, like Pete Ink Russo setting the relief valve, Fred Bray watching the panel, or Lee Backman checking the generator with Dan Amadich. There are some 89 separate steps in engine test, and sometimes it seems like they all have to be done at once. Incidentally, the water you see coming out of the plane is used to keep the engine cool while it's tested on the ground. Following engine test, we swing the ship on the compass rose. It takes a lot of experience to get the knack of this job. Just watch Earl Eastman head her right up toward the North Pole. Now the ship goes into pre-flight hangar for a complete checkover. And if you find something unusual, you holler for your lead man. That is, lead woman, if you're on Dorothy Gartsky's crew. Then after another run-up, the ship is checked again at the combat hangar, and it's ready for the initial flight line. It's the test pilot show from now on. This is Johnny Wiles, and the crew chief getting him set is Manly Knutson. The flight inspector for this ship is Dan Campion. And between the 3 of them, believe it or not, they know every nut and bolt, every rivet in the airplane. Flight inspector and crew chief. That airplane is there, baby, and it's a mighty important moment when it goes down the runway for the first time. After the first flight, the ship is flown again from the recheck hangar. When everything is okay, it goes to modification for any final work before delivery. Some of the ships go to Dade Brothers for crating, and some are gassed up to be flown away by the ferry pilots. When our department, 61 Department, gets through with an Airacobra, it's on its way to plant some 37mm shells where they'll do the most good, right smack in Hitler's and Hirohito's axis.
It was mid-1942. The U.S. Army Air Forces had arrived en masse in Britain, within range of the German heartland. Huge airfields now dotted the English countryside. Boeing B-17s, the flying fortresses, began to roll in.
The B-17 arrival in Europe was met with great acclaim. The Americans showing up finally in 1942 was just great. And then setting up the 8th Air Force and then bringing in the Flying Fortress, was a great thing for the British people to observe. As time went on, we got more and more airplanes coming onto our base, more and more crews coming in. So yes, we're beginning to recognize that the production of B-17s back in the States had really picked up and was really rolling.
The plan was for a massive, unrelenting bombing campaign, one that would finally test the idea that a war could be won by strategic bombardment of the enemy.
They'll fly in a tight formation, and we will hit the enemy's strategic nerve points. And there's the theory, and now, thank heavens, we have the weapons to do it. And then comes this decisive day in October 1943, where a very large group of B-17s fly off in perfect daylight to attack these vital German centers of ball bearing production in Schweinfurt. They find themselves subject to the most astonishing set of attacks by the Luftwaffe, carefully coordinated with some fighters coming from below, some from above, some from directly ahead, and the result that day is devastating. 60 B-17 bombers wiped out.
Schweinfurt was a terrible place to go because there was a ball bearing factory there. Or every moving military vehicle or civilian vehicle rolls on ball bearings. So this target was the most well-defended. The German fighter pilots were plentiful and they were skilled, and so we got hit up pretty badly. We lost 60 airplanes. That meant 600 people didn't make it back home. And our own airplanes came back, lost an engine, shot up pretty bad. My partner in the left waist was killed.
And that raid on Schweinfurt was one of the most devastating air battles in history and became known as Black Thursday.
This was such a shock to the system that they really began to see, ow, the bomber was supposed to get through, and we were sure we had all the defensive preparation, but it doesn't look like that.
So now this whole air war becomes, ironically, what it wasn't supposed to be, trench warfare in the sky.
Well, the gentleman we're going to hear from next is the highest scoring living American ace from World War II, flying a P-51 Mustang that he nicknamed Old Crow. Bud Anderson shot down 16 enemy airplanes during 116 combat missions in Europe between 1942 and 1945. He also flew combat missions in Korea and Vietnam before retiring from the United States Air Force as a colonel in 1972. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Bud Anderson.
Colonel, why is it important for us to commemorate VE Day 75 years later?
World War II was a big deal. They had these two dictators in Europe that decided they're going to conquer Europe and enslave the people, put them to work. So it was a grave situation. And I think most Americans knew that. But once Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, the country had a transformation, as I recall, and saying, oh my goodness, this really is serious. The country got behind the government, and but the tremendous manufacturing capability was mobilized, and everybody was working towards winning the war. And our country became very patriotic. Everybody wanted to know what was going on in the war. Everybody had somebody in the service. And I think, well, you know, they called it the greatest generation, but we were all just doing what we knew we had to do. The whole thing of World War II needs to be remembered. It was just a different time, and I don't think we'll see it again.
If there is such a thing as a regular mission, please describe one. How many aircraft, what types, and what were the missions?
I would say there is no typical mission. It would be like playing cards. You know, you get a hand, and you got to deal with it the way, you know, what's in your hand. But in general, I could tell you, most of our missions were escorting the B-17s and B-24s over Germany. We were transferred to the 8th Air Force. Let's say a mission to Berlin, perhaps. We had a B-17 group very close to us, and we could hear them taking off while we're still in bed. So we'd go to the big briefing, and then we'd find out where we're going. Then you started the engine up on start engine time, and you taxied out, and then you looked for your flight to come by. And then you taxied out and got in position. Here we are now. We're taxiing out 16 airplanes, and probably had 2 spares behind that. And then the leader would set course. We'd fly a kind of line of rest on a straight course towards our rendezvous with the bombers.
The very concept of a flying fortress, a self-defending bomber, was called into question.
They wanted the B-17s and the rest of them to simply fight their way through, fight off the enemy fighters with defensive firepower, and succeed that way. It didn't work. You had to have fighter coverage.
At stake was the entire Allied war effort. If the German military-industrial base was invulnerable, its armies and air force would continue to dominate.
You're not going to be able to actually land on D-Day. You're not going to be able to win the war in Europe, win the war at all, unless you have a long-range escorting fighter. And so they actually pull back for several months while they're scratching their heads. The whole air war is, you know, point, counterpoint, check, counter check. We need to figure out what to do. So in fact, although it's not well known, American strategic bombing of Germany grinds to a halt between late October of 1943 and the beginning of 1944, which is cutting it very late.
The solution was a combination of American and British engineering and a bit of luck. Early in the war, the British had turned to North American aviation's Dutch Kindleberger to build a fighter to challenge the German blitzkrieg.
Kindleberger said, I'll tell you what, you give me 100 days, and I will come up with not just a design for you, but I'll build you a prototype. You fly it around and see what you think.
And in a record 102 days, North American designed and built what would become the P-51 Mustang, a sleek, highly maneuverable modern fighter, but it had a problem.
In their trials, they discover that while it has many wonderful maneuverable capacities and capabilities, it just doesn't seem totally effective over 19,000 feet. And our bombers, and the American bombers especially, are flying at 24,000 feet. So it can't protect them. Therefore, they think it's not going to work. So they actually turned to the most experienced test pilot from Rolls-Royce, and they bring Ronnie Harker down. And the story is quite gorgeous. It's almost a, Steven Spielberg movie. But then he says, I've noticed that the front end of this P-51 is about the same length that would take the brand new, ultra-powerful Rolls-Royce 61 engine. So they set out to drop in the Rolls-Royce engine, bolt it up, and then Harker takes it and flies it. And when he comes down, his report is just something that blows your mind. It blows the mind of any aerospace historian. He says, it's still as wonderful and maneuverable as ever, but now with this engine in, I can get it up to 40,000 feet, and it can fly 440 miles an hour. I think this one can escort our bombers all the way to Berlin. And the transformation is something which itself is wonderful, the transformation of the balance of power in the air.
Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, later remarked, "The day I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost."
Charles McGee is one of the last living members of the Tuskegee Airmen, an all-African-American military pilot group. Although he made headlines this year when he flipped the coin at Super Bowl and got promoted to Brigadier General shortly after celebrating his 100th birthday, General McGee was an accomplished fighter pilot who overcame institutional racism in the United States military to fight for his country in World War II. Like Colonel Anderson, after the war, General McGee stayed in the Air Force and served in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Before retiring from the Air Force in 1973, he'd flown a total of 409 combat missions during 3 different wars.
Charles, your incredible career in the Air Force, what is your experience growing up and in the Air Force told you about our country, about what our country is?
Well, that's how much time do we have? Interesting, it told that we can support the country regardless of our color or accident of birth. It's more about being prepared. It's about having an education, being willing to serve this country and enjoy the freedoms that we so much enjoy, that creeping away in many little ways. But it's something that we need to let our young folks know. I think even that's what this flyby is going to do. Remember, don't forget, but we don't need to repeat it. And this is the type of thing that I think out of lessons, our experience allowed the move away from the attitudes that existed earlier, saying something we couldn't do or denying an opportunity. But it lifted up the challenge of being prepared, and this is a challenge to our young people today. There's so much going on, but it's the things they need to know to be a part of our country's future and continue to enjoy the freedoms that we have.
And there you were with your P-51 group in Italy. And what were your missions? What were you flying?
And our missions was to save American lives. And we had the leadership that told us, young Rice, second and first lieutenants that would like to go off and get a victory and become an ace. If you leave the bomber not under attack, you'll be going home. He said, you take care of it. Our focus strictly, and the reason the 332nd Fighter Group, with 3 others, were picked to begin the escort work, well, we thought we had enough guns on the B-17s and B-24s to protect them from the German Air Force. That wasn't happening. Of course, at that time, a bomber going out was 10 American lives. And so, as I say, with good leadership and one we respected, B.O. Davis Jr., we stuck with the bombers. And in fact, at the point, I think at one time, B.O. even changed the name on his airplane to by request, because we were the Red Tails. Now, maybe I can tell folks why. A lot of folks want to know why we were the Red Tails. Fortunately, I think somebody at 15th Air Force realized that suddenly providing these planes, they wanted the gunners to know these are friendly. These aren't German aircraft. So of the 4 groups, one had a yellow tail, one had candy stripe, red and white, one had orange and black checkerboard. 332nd Fighter Group was the Red Tails. And that has stuck. So besides calling us Tuskegee Airmen, they still talk about the Red Tails. But I'd like to tell folks, Red Tail is part of the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. The other half of the story is the medium bomber pilots that didn't get into combat, but as we said earlier, helped solve that second victory against what was taking place here at home.
The decisive contest for air superiority over the entire European battlefield was waged over the winter and spring of 1944. Allied tactics changed with the arrival of the Mustangs. They no longer simply escorted the bombers, they took the fight directly to the Luftwaffe, in the air and on the ground.
Today's orders were, pursue and destroy the enemy.
The Mustangs and other Allied fighters, like the P-47 and the P-38, were outfitted with additional fuel tanks and were able to range over almost all of the German countryside. One week in late February 1944 became known as the Big Week.
We're about to hit the Nazis for 6 consecutive days and nights. The Allies hope to finally win air superiority over the Luftwaffe. The liberation of Europe was at stake.
The Big Week set in motion the siege of Germany from the air that would continue until the end of the war in Europe.
The Mustangs plunged into the fight.
The Germans closed in.
The gigantic fighter battle raged across the European skies, with victories by our fighters alone of 60, 85, and over 100 enemy aircraft destroyed each day.
It was a battle with terrible costs on both sides. Scores of Allied planes and crew were lost. But the toll on the Luftwaffe was far greater. By the late spring, it had lost its air supremacy over the German homeland.
With air domination itself at stake, the Luftwaffe disappeared from the skies.
The domination of the American Air Force over the German countryside was so great that they could afford to shoot an enemy bicyclist carrying a dispatch. I mean, they had so many airplanes, they were looking for targets.
Fighter bombers smashed Nazi barges and railway trains.
The fighter planes took out the transport. They took out the canals, the railroads, the trucks. The Germans couldn't get anything to anybody because there's no means to transport them.
The bombers begin the invasion blow.
The Luftwaffe could no longer inflict the devastation on Allied bombers that just months before had brought Allied bombing to a halt.
Great air fleets hitting German defenses. Thousands of tons of high explosives rain down. Watch, a road junction is hit.
Can you imagine being a person in Germany, not thinking the war is going too well and wondering how it's going to come up, and then look and see 1,000 B-17s, an unending stream of airplanes every day?
It was called an air train. When the first plane hit German airspace, the tail was still in England. It was amazing. And then at evening time, they would come back for night raids and the ground would shake again.
But the war was far from over. Controlling the skies and devastating the Nazi war machine cleared the way for the Allies' ground invasion of Europe. D-Day, June 6, 1944, was the largest Allied military operation of the war. 150,000 men landed on the French beaches at Normandy, and the decisive ground war with Germany began. And on that day, Germany could muster just 319 planes to counter the more than 12,000 Allied aircraft deployed during the invasion. And for the next year, fiercely contested battles were fought, but the Allies controlled the air above. And the German war machine was beyond repair.
And I often think that there ought to be a monument for the over 18,000 airmen who were casualties in the 5-month run-up to D-Day. That's double the number of casualties we took on the beaches on D-Day.
Well, our next vet started out as a paper boy reading about the war in the Pacific, specifically the SPD Dauntless at the Battle of Midway. Never dreamed he'd be in the back seat himself. Here now is Paul Hilliard.
Well, I was a farm boy, and I was in high school in northern Wisconsin, a small town, and but I had a paper route, and I loved history and geography, and I said, well, as a farm kid in the boondocks, he said, in the Depression and the drought, I said, well, I'd never been any place, didn't think I was ever going to go any place, so I loved geography because it was about other places, and. So I read about the Battle of Midway and the SPDs and so on, which is a heck of a story. And for 16, just turning 17, I guess. And but when I read about it, it never dawned I'd end up in an SPD. But it was a great airplane, as great story, great legacy. So, but the B-29 means a lot to me because they sent us home. In July, they sent us back for reassignment, and we were flying out of Zamboanga, Mindanao, which is close to the end of the world. And they sent us home. They said, going home for reassignment, and I was on leave. I was on a train, I think, between San Diego and Chicago when they dropped the first A-bomb. And the night I got home, and my mother lived in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and they dropped the second one. We didn't know much about it, but a week later, the Jap says this deal's not working out to our satisfaction, and they surrendered. And the next morning I woke up on my mother's lawn. I guess I had a good time. Everybody had a good time.
Why is this important today, what we're doing? Give us the lowdown.
Well, I think it was a great period in American history, and you think America sent 6-7 million young men around the world to free, not just keep America free, but just to free millions of others. I think about Normandy. Every time I've been over there, I say, this was a battlefield victory to us, but it was freedom to millions and millions of people in Europe and Asia and the rest of the world. So it's a great time in American history, and that shows, I think, the power of freedom and what a free people can do and what they'll do, not just to protect their own freedom, but to gain freedom for other people. And I think that's uniquely American. And so I'm a believer in American exceptionalism.
In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. But that did not bring an end to World War II. The war against Japan continued. Japan, like Germany, had conquered vast stretches of territory. And the United States military believed that strategic bombardment would also be essential to defeating its Pacific enemy. But to destroy the Japanese industrial base, the U.S. would need a bomber that could fly much further than the B-17.
In the Pacific, we had to operate over ranges that were much greater than the kind of ranges we had in Europe, over vast stretches of the ocean.
You're going to need planes with fantastic range.
And during the war, Boeing was developing just such a plane, the B-29, known as the Superfortress.
The B-29 was a four-engine super bomber that would travel farther and carry a bigger bomb load than any plane had done in history.
This B-29, which is to be the bomber beyond all bombers. And it's going to be the ultimate war-winning machine if the war goes on. And remember, many planners thought that especially the war against Japan might not finish until 1947.
When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the B-29 was a design on paper. But once America declared war on Japan, the Army Air Forces wanted Boeing to start delivering them within 2 years at a rate of 25 a month. The construction of the factory, the design, the building of the prototype, the testing, and even the manufacturing would have to happen at virtually the same time. The plane was going to have to be mass-produced and flown before the engineers even knew for sure that all of its complicated systems would work. In Wichita, Kansas, the plant that took shape was enormous. Built in the midst of wheat fields in just 18 months, thousands of workers were hired and trained.
People had never seen an airplane, quite literally, had never seen an airplane firsthand on the ground, were suddenly building this massive thing which required thousands of parts and miles of wiring.
The B-29 represented a huge step away from the B-17. The B-17 had been unpressurized. I mean, the waist gunners in a B-17 were operating in the substratosphere in sub-zero temperatures with the windows open, as it were. Really a very tough way to fight a war. And so Boeing decided to build the B-29 as a pressurized airplane in the crew areas.
Pressurization would allow the crew to breathe without oxygen masks and to fly in a temperature-controlled environment.
They were so ambitious, they said, not only will we have a pressurized cabin at the front of the aircraft, but at the rear of the aircraft, where the rear gunners will be, they also will be pressurized.
How do you pressurize an entire cabin like that, a cabin that's spacious? Well, they come up with a tunnel idea where you move from the cockpit to the back of the plane, crawling through a tunnel, so you don't have to pressurize the bomb bay.
Constructing a plane that involved these kinds of technology and engineering challenges was something that involved an enormous amount of effort. Nothing really had perplexed as many minds and as many companies as the B-29. It was not just an airplane, it was an industrial project of a size and scale that American industry had never engaged in.
The Superfortress was a collective national industrial effort on every level. There were thousands of subcontractors building everything from wheels to propellers to engines. The plane had over 40,000 different parts. Each B-29 had 1 million rivets holding it together. The mission of the B-29 was to bridge the expanse of the Pacific and eventually bring the kind of strategic bombing that had destroyed German industry to the Japanese heartland. But it had another deeply secret mission. If the Manhattan Project was successful, the project to develop the atomic bomb, then the B-29 would deliver it. the U.S. government would spend more on the B-29 than any other weapon.
The B-29 cost about $3 billion, and had it not worked, it would have meant that the next most expensive project, the atom bomb, which cost $2 billion, wouldn't have been deliverable.
What happened in Wichita was going to determine the outcome of the war.
Everything was to be more sophisticated than anything which had gone before. That means that you're in new territory, and some of the things aren't going to work until you try it out and try it out. So there's delays, inevitable delays, and this is why it was called, as a joke, so to speak, but it was a bittersweet joke, it was called the Battle of Kansas. Can we win the Battle of Kansas? And there was quite a question mark about this.
The Battle of Kansas was a battle against time, and time was costing lives. In 1943, American forces were taking thousands of casualties as they fought their way island by island across the Pacific. But the B-29, the plane that would take the fight to the Japanese homeland, was still not ready.
It's just a hugely complicated airplane, even for Boeing, which is used to building complicated airplanes. Because the B-29s are flying with huge engines, multi-bank rows of cylinders, the problem of cooling the cylinders at the back end of the engine just becomes horribly difficult, and engine fires become a real problem.
Boeing's most senior test pilot, Eddie Allen, and a 10-man crew died on an early test flight when one of the B-29's engines caught fire.
And along with Eddie Allen's death, also many believe that would be the end of the B-29 as a project. That this was a plane that was unflyable, that this was a plane that had too many problems, was too dangerous to take up into the air, let alone to be sent into combat.
Accidents, engine fires, nothing halted the B-29's development and production. The war in the Pacific demanded a superfortress. The head of the Army Air Forces, General Hap Arnold, had staked his career on the B-29 and the idea that Japan could be bombed into surrender.
Roosevelt is pressing Arnold, who in turn is pressing Boeing to get the plane on basis by early summer of '44.
Hap Arnold was always presented as this lovely, smiling guy, you know, in the photo ops, but he was a tough manager, and he was on people fiercely, and he was on Boeing fiercely.
The D-Day in the Pacific is set for June 1944 and is going to be Saipan. There's 3 islands in the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, and we're going to locate bases there to attack Japan. But Arnold wants the bomber before that. He wants to test it out.
Arnold arrived in Wichita in March 1944, expecting to take delivery of more than 150 B-29s.
He fully expected these bombers to be ready. And he was told when he got there, we ain't ready. And not only that, we don't know when we're gonna be ready. He just exploded. But Arnold is an inventive guy, and he is a possibilist, he's a doer. And he said, even if it's 96% ready, we need it. We need it, we need it now. And so he rushes in extra help, and it's called the Kansas Miracle. In just a little over a month, he's able to have his planes operational.
By the summer of 1944, factories were producing more than 50 B-29s a month, and they were heading for the Pacific.
The first B-29 rolls out.
They got an alert that, you know, we had broken the code, the Japanese code, they got an alert that the Japanese were considering an attack on the Panama Canal. And so I was shipped down to Tulare, Peru, to fly patrol from there to the Galapagos Islands. And we flew patrol back and forth because they thought the Japanese were going to go around and come in from the south, which was less defended than the north side of the Panama Canal. So I flew out of Peru for almost a year to the Galapagos Islands. And by this time I had accumulated 1,000 hours in 4-engine aircraft. And Arnold put out a call for all...
General Hap Arnold.
Hap Arnold, who was head of the Air Force, I'm sure you all know, put out a call for all pilots with 1,000 hours of 4-engine time should be brought back to the United States and get involved in this B-29 program. And so all of a sudden I was jerked back to Pratt, Kansas, and showing this airplane in a commercial hangar of the airport at Pratt, Kansas, and the airplane was sticking out of the sides of the hangar. It was so big, and I thought to myself, my God, somebody going to fly this damn thing? And the next thing you know, they said that it had the characteristics of a B-26 bomber. So off to B-26 flying school at Del Rio, Texas, and I learned to fly the B-26, and came back, and a Boeing test pilot checked me out with 2 hours and 15 minutes of time. The next thing that happened was they informed me that I was going to Wichita, Kansas, with a captain. I was a lieutenant, to pick up the first B-29 the Air Force accepted, and it came off of the production line at Wichita, which was a tremendous operation. We went there, and they had an airplane all set up, and they broke a bottle of champagne on the nose wheel, and it came time to take the airplane back to Pratt, Kansas. And I, being a lieutenant, naturally deferred to the captain that he would fly it. And he said, no, you're going to fly it. And I said, well, I only have 2 hours and 15 minutes in this airplane. And he said, well, I only have an hour and a half. So I got to take off take the B-29 to Pratt, Kansas with 2 hours and 15 minutes of time, and from then on it was B-29s. I did about everything that you could in a B-29 from there to the end of the war. I flew on the first mission over Japan and the last mission over Japan.
It was just 2.5 years since the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. The superfortresses were arriving in the Pacific theater by the dozens, and then by the hundreds.
Well, the B-29 was such a beautiful plane, and I interviewed guys who said they'd go out on the base like a kid going out, you know, waxing and shining up his car and shining the wing up, and it glistened. It was a gorgeous plane.
The pilots had to deal with enormous aircraft full of fuel, full of bombs, full of armor plating. It's bigger and takes lots of handling. You have to think about the speed at which it takes off, the speed at which it comes in.
With their bomb bays packed with the heaviest loads in history, the B-29s barreled down newly constructed runways for one of the most dangerous parts of the mission, takeoff.
They would kind of wobble in the air, and everybody on the ground was saying, oh my God,
But once airborne, flying from bases on newly conquered islands like Saipan and Tinian, the B-29 proved itself the aerial weapon it was designed to be.
The plane could stay airborne for 17 hours. Now that's really crucial when you're flying over the open, empty Pacific with all those sharks. They're flying in the, at 30,000 feet. In winter, it's 62 degrees below zero over Japan.
No part of the Japanese Empire is now out of our range. No war factory too remote to feel our bombs. The battle for Japan is now underway with full speed ahead.
Once the bitterly contested volcanic island of Iwo Jima fell, just 700 miles from the Japanese mainland, North American P-51s could enter the battle as fighter escorts and attack aircraft. By the spring of 1945, much of the Imperial Air Force was destroyed. And the B-29s were attacking from as little as 5,000 feet, making the bombing more accurate and more devastating. Tokyo was in ruins. But the Emperor of Japan, even after seeing the destruction for himself, refused to command his military to surrender. The war in the Pacific went on.
Carnegie, you went to CBI, China-Burma-India Theater.
Right.
What was the United States doing in China-Burma-India?
All right. When the B-29s first went into combat, they didn't have the islands in Saipan and so on. So in order to test the B-29, basically that's what it was. Because we bombed, we had to take off from India with our bombs over to China. We had 4 forward bases in China where each group would go and land and gas up again and then go on for a 15-hour mission to Manchuria, Japan, and so on. And that's how the war was developed at that point. We didn't do as much damage as was done later, but in terms of showing the Japanese that they're vulnerable, that had an impact.
Go back to the POW experience, if you would.
Yeah.
6 months?
6 months, yeah.
And what were the facilities, or were there?
All right.
Were
the
you outdoors?
facilities was an old British compound, prison. It was like the spokes of a wagon wheel, and each spoke was a compound. So in the center was the pump house and the supposed medical. There was no medical. And we were, after landing, I met my co-pilot, and they took us across the little river, as I said, and the Japanese newsreel was going. I said, oh boy, we're going to be on the news tonight. And finally, we got to the other side, and they marched us to a building where we were to be interrogated, apparently. So after being thrown in these prisons, wooden, teak wood bars, it wasn't metal bars, teak wood bars, and quite large rooms. And I was in one, and another one was somewhere else. And finally, I met my co-pilot again through just talking. He was in the next cell. He said, "Tommy," and they used to call me Tommy then, and just keep your cool and don't tell them anything particularly in detail. Make up what you can, but make it plausible. And so that's what I did. And so they asked me different things, and this one guy from India who was collaborating with them, he would ask me questions about the Indian base. So I answered, I said, "You're asking me to quit. You're Indian, you have your men there. What are you asking me for?" And I got boom, boom, boom. But it's reasonable to say if they wanted to kill us with sticks, they could have. They didn't. They just made us hurt, that's all.
In May and June 1945, the Army had the greatest number of its casualties ever since the Civil War in taking the islands of Okinawa.
On Okinawa, the Emperor's soldiers and civilians endured relentless bombing, but they still would not surrender.
The calculations of how many casualties the Army and Marine Corps would take landing on the home islands of Japan were just enormous.
Every soldier, sailor, and pilot in the Pacific War had the same hope resting on the B-29. Make the Japanese Imperial Armed Forces surrender before an invasion. The turning point in the war was a day without precedent in all of history. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay flew the 1,500 miles from a base on the island of Tinian to Hiroshima. It dropped the first atomic bomb, followed by the bombing of Nagasaki on August 9th. Aboard the battleship USS Missouri, on September 2nd, the Japanese surrendered. There would be no invasion. The once untested theory of strategic bombardment had proven decisive. The war was over. But the legacy of World War II was not to be the machines and the weapons that were built to wage it. The 12,000 B-17s and 4,000 B-29s were instruments of victory. But they were soon eclipsed by even more innovative and sophisticated technology. The enduring legacy of the war is the industry that was created to build them. The factories, the plants that were the arsenal of democracy. They became the industrial engine for generations to follow.
At this point, all of the aircraft participating in today's flyover have made their way to hold points in the suburbs of Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. The first formations have already started their low-level runs down the Potomac and will soon take a left turn at the Lincoln Memorial before heading straight down the National Mall. You will soon see some of the rarest and most well-maintained historic aircraft in the world. An amazing assembly of airplanes at any time, but especially so during a pandemic. Nearly all of them are themselves veterans of World War II. One of them in particular, a C-47 transport aircraft nicknamed That's All Brother, led a formation of hundreds of cargo aircraft that dropped more than 10,000 airborne infantry members on June 6, 1944. As they make their way down the National Mall, and as you hear the stories associated with these amazing airplanes, remember that your fellow Americans manufactured them, maintained them, flew them, and sometimes jumped out of them. They built and used these tools to achieve the greatest victory in the history of the world. It's been my pleasure to share this time with you ahead of this morning's historic flyover. And before I turn it over to my good friend Rob Ryder, the narrator for today's Arsenal of Democracy flyover, we're pleased to share this special message from our presenting sponsor, Linda Hope of the Bob Hope Legacy, part of the Bob and Dolores Hope Foundation.
It gives me great pleasure to share a welcoming message from Linda Hope of the Bob Hope Legacy, representing the Bob and Dolores Hope Foundation. Their generous support of the World War II 75th commemoration ensures that the legacy of all veterans continues to inspire and motivate our children, those who are destined to lead our future.
World War II was a pivotal moment in American and world history. When the freedom of the world was threatened, millions of Americans rose to its defense. They fought in combat in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, helped build the arsenal of democracy in our factories, and raise the spirits of our troops, as my dad Bob Hope and many of his fellow entertainers did. Everyone played a role in achieving victory and establishing an enduring peace. Bob Hope, with a small band of performers, traveled to bases throughout the U.S. and around the globe to entertain our service members, visiting hospitals and installations in theaters of war in Europe and the South Pacific. Travel to those distant locations was grueling, and the conditions upon arrival were often dangerous. Yet those were the shows most near and dear to Bob's heart, and to the hearts of the hundreds of thousands of troops who never forgot the taste of home and hope he brought them. As we commemorate 75 years since the end of World War II, we salute our service members and the everyday Americans who contributed to the war effort for their heroic actions. Their patriotism still inspires us and will continue to inspire Americans forever. We promise to carry their stories forward, instilling in our future leaders a new appreciation for the sacrifices made by the entire generation that truly defined the spirit of America.
Good morning, veterans and families and all who are watching and all who share an interest in the history of our nation. We welcome you to the Arsenal of Democracy World War II Victory Commemoration Flyover event. We're here to commemorate the Allied victory in World War II. My name is Rob Ryder. I'm broadcasting live from atop the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Due to weather conditions, the aircraft participating in the Arsenal of Democracy flyover commemorating the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II will be unable to safely take flight today. Our authorization through the restricted airspace around Washington, D.C. will expire today, and rescheduling the flying portion of the event is unfortunately not an option. We have produced for you a broadcast that will feature never-before-seen footage of many of the aircraft scheduled to participate in the Arsenal of Democracy flyover, including video shot on Thursday during the practice flights for the planned flyover. We thank you for joining us today and hope you enjoy the program. At the conclusion of this flyover portion, we will have a very special and thoughtful interview with Brigadier General Charles McGee, who spoke with members of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum just last night. We hope you enjoy this exclusive programming, and it's made possible by our friends at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. All of the World War II aircraft that you'll see here today were flown 3/4 of a century ago by men who have come to be known as the greatest generation. They left their families, their jobs, and their peacetime lives to fight oppression and defend freedom in every corner of the globe. But as grateful as we are for their bravery, sacrifice, and service, we are here today to celebrate not just G.I. Joe, but Rosie the Riveter as well. In a speech that he made in December of 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt recognized that the great arsenal of democracy would play a pivotal role in this country's anticipated involvement in the war that was already raging across much of the world. President Roosevelt understood the raw power of the United States and its people when they focused their will and resources on a single common goal. He knew that once this country became involved in hostilities, the immense U.S. industrial complex would transition from the peacetime manufacturer of automobiles, tractors, and airliners to the wartime production of jeeps, tanks, and airplanes. And he was right. For the second time in less than a quarter century, the American people were called on to help save the world from the forces of tyranny and oppression. And on the battlefields of Europe, in the waters of the South Pacific, and in the factories throughout our great nation, they have responded to that challenge as Americans always have. In the intervening years, the stories of what those brave Americans did and how they did it have been told less and less frequently. In the history books and in the classrooms of our schools, the narrative of World War II has been relegated to a couple of pages in history books or a day or two of instruction. Those stories deserve more. Americans should know that not so very long ago, our way of life, our freedom, and the fate of much of the world hung in the balance. And in the resolve with which this country rose to face that challenge is even 75 years later awe-inspiring. Over the last several months, as we prepared for this event, we identified several themes common to all those who helped earn the Allied victory in World War II. First, everyone participated, if not in uniform, then working in the factories, producing the machines and building those things and producing the munitions and supplies that our boys put to such effective use in every corner of the globe. Second, World War II veterans are genuinely humble about the risks they took and the deprivations they faced when they willingly walked into harm's way to protect and defend our country nearly 80 years ago. Finally, and most poignantly, we've been struck by the deep respect that the surviving veterans have for those who they consider to be the real heroes of World War II, those men who didn't come home. The warriors who gave their last full measure of devotion to the epic struggle that took place 7 decades ago in faraway places like Burma, Bataan, and Bastogne, Carentan, Cassino, and the Coral Sea, and Tinian, Tunisia, and Tarawa. Today, with the generous support provided by the Bob Hope Legacy, the Bob and Dolores Hope Foundation, and other corporate sponsors, it is our great honor to use a remarkable collection of more than 60 vintage military aircraft to tell their stories. In the period immediately preceding World War II, the Army and Navy did not yet have sufficient resources to patrol and protect shipping routes in the Atlantic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. At a time when German submarines were prowling off the waters off the eastern shore of the country and sinking vitally important tankers, the military's senior leadership asked for help from the newly formed Civil Air Patrol, an organization of civilian pilots volunteering to use their aircraft in defense of the nation. Armed with small bombs and depth charges, the CAP's Coastal Patrol used light single-engine aircraft to fly missions from 21 bases from Maine to Texas. The aircraft used by the Civil Air Patrol included light aircraft like these L-4 Grasshoppers. If they look familiar, that's because beneath that military paint job The L4 Grasshopper is the Piper J3 Cub. The Cub's simple design and construction, together with its maneuverability and low cost, made it an excellent reconnaissance, liaison, and ground control aircraft for the military. And by the end of the war, more than 5,000 were produced as L4 Grasshoppers. But the Cubs used by the Civil Air Patrol, particularly those flown in the earliest days of the war, were principally civilian-owned Cubs that were repurposed as coastal patrol aircraft. Over an 18-month period, the Civil Air Patrol spotted 173 possible submarines, attacked 57, dropped 82 bombs, and also flew over 24 million miles during 5,684 convoy support missions. Its efforts helped the military push the submarine threat well away from coastal patrol shipping lanes, but not without cost. The Coastal Patrol suffered 26 fatalities and 90 aircraft were destroyed during the early years of the war. One of the other aircraft used extensively by the CAP's Coastal Patrol was the Stinson L5 Sentinel, affectionately known as the Flying Jeep. Based loosely on the design of the Stinson 108, a general aviation aircraft, the L5 was the only purpose-built U.S. liaison aircraft built for the military during World War II. All of the other liaison planes were lightly modified, off-the-shelf civilian models. Nearly 4,000 were built by the end of 1945, making it the second most widely used liaison observation aircraft behind the Piper L4 Grasshopper. In addition to Coastal Patrol, CAP pilots performed many critical tasks, including search and rescue, target towing, border patrol, forest fire patrol, interceptor training, and dozens of other missions. In the years since it was formed, just before World War II, the Civil Air Patrol has become an iconic organization in the American aviation community and a frequent starting point for many of the country's professional pilots, both civilian and military. The CAP is the official auxiliary of the United States Air Force. In 1938, when General Hap Arnold, commander of America's Air Forces, considered this country's preparedness for war, he recognized that America did not have nearly enough airplanes or pilots to fly them. 3 years before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, what would later become the U.S. Army Air Force was comprised of 21,000 airmen and 1,800 aircraft. By the end of the war, the Army Air Force included 2.3 million people, and production of aircraft of all types reached nearly 300,000. In a war that military leaders quickly discovered would be determined by air superiority, this unprecedented increase in American air power was widely recognized to be one of the most important factors for the Allies' victory. And right in the center of this effort was the need to quickly and efficiently train hundreds of thousands of military pilots. Every military pilot's training began with ground school and their first flights in a primary training aircraft, like this de Havilland Tiger Moth, painted in the colors of a training aircraft used by the Royal Air Force. First flown in 1931 and not fully retired until 1959. The Tiger Moth was the primary trainer for 2 generations of British and Commonwealth country military pilots. Slow and forgiving of student pilot mistakes, the Tiger Moth was widely known to be easy to fly, but difficult to fly well. In total, nearly 9,000 were built, and many are still flown by civilian pilots in the UK and throughout the rest of the world. Most military pilots completed a training program that was accomplished in 3 phases: primary, basic, and advanced. This process was designed to gradually increase the complexity of a pilot's training. The primary phase familiarized the student pilot with the principles of flight. Basic introduced them to the complexities of radio communication and flying in formation. And advanced training was designed to prepare the air crews to go into combat. At the beginning of World War II, flight training lasted 9 months, with 12 weeks of primary, 12 weeks of basic, and 12 weeks of advanced training. Each pilot had 65 flying hours of primary training and 75 hours of basic and advanced training. By the end of the war, to help push pilots through and get them into combat, that 9-month program had been reduced to 7. One of the first aircraft many of these pilots ever saw was the ubiquitous Boeing Model 75 Stearman biplane. First introduced as a military trainer in 1934, these open cockpit fixed gear biplanes were constructed of steel, I should say wood, fabric, and tubular steel. With a tandem seat configuration, the student typically occupied the front seat with the instructor seated behind. During World War II, these airplanes cost $11,000 per copy, and Boeing delivered more than 10,000 of them to the U.S. Army Air Forces, the U.S. Navy, and the Royal Canadian Air Force. As a matter of fact, the RCAF called it the Cadet. It also earned the nickname Yellow Peril. One source says that that nickname was earned because if a student didn't solo in a certain number of hours, he was in peril of being washed out of the program. Another referred to the narrow landing gear on the Boeing Stearman and its difficult or perilous handling characteristics on the ground and its propensity to do the dreaded ground loop. Although the history of aerial warfare during World War II focuses on the danger and high casualty rates of combat missions, the training phase for pilots and their crews was nearly as dangerous. In 1939, fewer than 1,000 military pilots graduated from basic training. By 1943, that figure had grown to 165,000. That unprecedented growth came with horrific losses. Nearly 15,000 young men died in aircrew training between 1942 and 1945 without ever leaving the United States. For most, the final stage of training before deploying overseas was advanced, and the most common advanced trainer throughout World War II was the North American Texan. Weighing in at nearly 3 tons with a 600 horsepower radial motor and retractable landing gear, the Texan was designed to prepare pilots to fly the state-of-the-art aircraft that they would use in combat. By the end of the war, North American had built more than 15,000 Texans, including the AT-6 variant for the United States Army Air Forces and the SNJ version for the Navy and Marine Corps. The Commonwealth countries used the Harvard variant of the Texan. After the war, the Texan enjoyed some success as a frontline combat aircraft flying missions for the Syrian, Israeli, Pakistani, Spanish, and Greek air forces. But the Texan's reputation and legacy were built on the critical role it played during World War II, providing the ideal training platform for tens of thousands of Allied pilots. Texans were even served as target spotting aircraft during the Korean conflict of 1950 to 1953. They were reconfigured with white phosphorus rockets, flying low and slow over the battlefield, seeking out targets or attracting ground fire. They would circle back around, fire those Willie Petes, as they were known, that put out huge volumes of white smoke and call up to the fast-moving jets who often had a hard time locating the targets, and they'd say, "Hit the smoke." The American military's aviation training requirements were not limited to pilots. Bombardiers in the U.S. Army Air Forces received 30 weeks of specialized training that included 120 hours of flight training and 160 practice bomb drops. Student bombardiers normally dropped 100-pound sand-filled practice bombs in training. Students were deemed to be proficient if they hit the target 1 out of 5 times. Navigators in training received more than 500 hours of ground instruction and spent more than 100 hours in the air sharpening their skills needed to get the aircraft from its home base to the target and back home again. Using only maps, compasses, watches, and intuition, they were expected to plot a route that was off by not more than 1 minute per hour of flight time and arrive within 15 miles of their objective, flying at night. The all-metal twin-engine AT-11, or Twin Beach as it was known, was the most common advanced trainer for these specialists. About 90% of the 45,000 Army Forces bombardiers in World War II did their training in the AT-11. Developed initially as a commercial transport aircraft in the late 1930s, the Beach Model 18 was designed with the expectation that it could easily be repurposed as a military aircraft. And it was. The U.S. military ordered more than 1,500 of them between 1941 and 1945, most of them used as training platforms and for gunners as well. And after the war, the Beach 18 was the world's most popular business aircraft, and production continued until 1969 with over 7,000 built. I'd like to take a moment now to thank the aircraft owners and operators who've joined us here this week to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. All of the airplanes you see today are national treasures, restored, maintained, and operated to help recognize and showcase the sacrifice, commitment, and accomplishments of the men and women who helped win World War II 3/4 of a century ago. From individual owners to small museums to the larger collections represented by the aircraft participating today, all of these planes have traveled here this week and are participating in this event as volunteers, letting us use these magnificent machines and their skills and experience as pilots to tell the story of a massive and successful effort by the Allies to defeat the forces of tyranny and defend freedom all those years ago. They've come from every corner of the globe to recognize and showcase and memorialize the greatest generation, the men and the women, civilians and military personnel who helped the Allies achieve victory in World War II. After invading Poland in September of 1939 and defeating France by the spring of 1940, the Germans had conquered virtually all of Western Europe and were planning Operation Sea Lion, an amphibious invasion of Great Britain that Adolf Hitler believed would end Allied resistance in Western Europe. In preparation for that invasion, Hitler ordered the British Royal Air Force to be neutralized. Throughout the summer and early fall of 1940, the full might of the German Air Force was focused on destroying the Royal Air Force, demoralizing the British people, and completing the German defeat of Allied forces. And these battles were fought at a time when the arsenal of democracy had only just begun to churn out weapons and armament, and while the Royal Air Force was still using only those pilots who had been trained prior to the start of the war. High in the skies over southern England, Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricane fighters, like those you see here, engaged German aircraft in aerial battles that would quite literally determine the outcome of the war. And after 4 months, the Royal Air Force prevailed, giving Germany its first major defeat of the war and prompting Hitler to indefinitely postpone his planned invasion of Great Britain. In memorializing the effort of the Royal Air Force during those desperate days in the summer of 1940, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously observed that, and I quote, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The Spitfire, one of the most elegant airplanes. I've talked to gentlemen who have flown both Mustangs and Spitfires, and believe it or not, they say they'd rather be flying a Spitfire. The Hawker Hurricanes and Spitfires were also aided by some American airplanes during that war, among them the P-40 Warhawk, and we'll talk more about that later. When Pearl Harbor was attacked by carrier-based aircraft of the Japanese Navy, the only modern U.S. Army Air Forces fighter stationed in Hawaii was the Curtiss P-40, an all-metal, 300-mile-per-hour 1937 design. The P-40 was rapidly overtaken by far more capable fighters, but at 8 o'clock on the morning of December 7th, 1941, this warplane was our country's first line of defense against 350 Japanese fighter planes, bombers, torpedo planes launched from 6 aircraft carriers. By 9 o'clock on that day, more than 2,400 Americans had been killed. Much of the Navy fleet had been ruined, and more than half of the Army Air Force's aircraft on Oahu were damaged beyond use. The lone aerial opposition came from individual pilots like Second Lieutenant George Welch, who raced for any airplane they could find. Flying a P-40, much like you see here, Welch shot down 4 Japanese aircraft on that day of infamy and was rewarded with the Distinguished Flying Cross. 2 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, 100 recruits, led by Claire Chennault, one of the most gifted and controversial commanders of the war, began flying P-40s to protect China from Japan. In 7 months, before the American Volunteer Group disbanded and incorporated into the 23rd Fighter Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces, the Flying Tigers Group savaged Japanese bombers and immortalized the fierce shark's teeth paint scheme on the nose of the P-40s. The P-40 flying alongside the Hurricanes and Spitfires back in the Battle of Britain were also, those P-40s were a very important link in bringing to the forefront the North American P-51 Mustang that we'll talk about in just a little bit. In April of 1942, after a series of stinging setbacks in the Pacific, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers off the aircraft carrier USS Hornet on a bombing raid to Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama, Japan. The raid was American improvisation at its finest. The B-25 wasn't designed to fly from an aircraft carrier, but an aircraft strike on the heartland of Japan so soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor provided Americans with a much-needed morale boost. Although the raid resulted in only minor damage to its targets, it had a profound effect on Japanese strategy, causing military leaders to be more concerned about attacks on Japan than they otherwise would have been. Doolittle thought that he was going to be court-martialed after losing all of the aircraft on the raid. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor and was promoted in the field, past colonel, to brigadier general. Although the B-25 is best known for its critical role in the Doolittle raid, it made important contributions in every battle of World War II. In the Pacific, it provided close air support, strafed Japanese targets and airfields, and destroyed bridges. In Europe, the Royal Air Force flew B-25s as medium bombers throughout occupied Europe, including in support of the Allies' Normandy invasion in June of 1944. And the Marine Corps used the PBJ-1 variant to find and destroy enemy ships and submarines. During the war, B-25s were also flown by the Canadians, Dutch, Australians, Soviets, Brazilians, and Chinese. And to this day, the Doolittle raid remains the air mission against which all other air missions have been measured. The B-25, also one of the most heavily field-modified aircraft in all of the war. One model actually included a 75-millimeter cannon in the nose. Others added many machine guns, increasing the firepower up to about 18 50-caliber machine guns, allowing it to strafe targets. The B-25 Mitchell bomber, one of about 9,600 built by North American Aviation. In early June of 1942, as the Japanese and American navies converged on a tiny volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the stage was set for a dramatic shift in momentum in the Pacific theater. A battle that one military historian would later call the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. Tipped off to Japanese plans by cryptographers who had broken Japanese radio codes, PBY Catalina flying boats were deployed from Midway Island to search hundreds of miles of open ocean for enemy ships. One of the most widely used seaplanes of World War II. More than 3,000 Catalinas were deployed during the war for anti-submarine warfare, search and rescue, convoy escort, cargo transport, and patrol bombing. Although very slow compared to most frontline combat aircraft of World War II, the Catalina had a range of 2,500 miles, which made it ideal for finding the Japanese in the wide expanse of the South Pacific Ocean. And early on the morning of June 3rd of 1942, Ensign John Reed and his crew from the U.S. Navy Patrol Squadron VP-44 located a portion of the Japanese force approximately 600 miles to the southwest of Midway. The crew radioed information back to military leadership, and the large, lumbering two-engine seaplane had provided the U.S. with an early advantage in the coming battle. After trading largely ineffective attacks in the early stages of the Battle of Midway, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers from 3 different U.S. carriers located and attacked the Japanese at mid-morning on June 4th. But logistical problems and bad luck plagued the Americans as they began their attack, and most of the American bombers were shot out of the sky. In the first 3 hours of the battle, not a single U.S. bomb or torpedo hit a Japanese ship, despite 8 separate attacks by a total of 94 airplanes. Then the tide turned. As the Japanese focused their attention on the torpedo bombers flying just off the surface of the water, SBD Dauntless dive bombers attacked from a higher altitude, fatally damaging 3 of 4 Japanese carriers. An hour later, a second attack by dive bombers destroyed the 4th Japanese carrier, and by day's end, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. We have with us 2 aircraft that were among the many different types of U.S. aircraft that participated in the Battle of Midway. The smaller of the 2 is the Grumman F8F Wildcat, the most advanced carrier-based fighter at the beginning of World War II. Although less maneuverable and slower than the Mitsubishi Zero, Japan's top fighter, the Wildcat held its own during the early stages of the war in the Pacific and was especially valuable during the Battle of Midway. Also built by Grumman, a small number of TBF Avenger torpedo bombers were present for the battle. Although 5 of 6 were shot down in the early stages of the engagement, the torpedo squadrons were credited with drawing fire of the Japanese, while the dive bombers conducted their attack from higher altitudes. The top Wildcat ace was Major John L. Smith, who shot down 19 Japanese planes. When the U.S. Marines stormed the shores of Guadalcanal in August of 1942, Japanese conquests had reached their peak. This bold, unexpected offensive would prove to be a critical turning point in the war in the Pacific. A small but strategic airfield on the island was the focal point of 6 months of fierce battles on the ground, in the air, and on the sea. By the time the Japanese conceded the island in February of 1943, nearly 25,000 Japanese and 1,600 Americans had been killed, with thousands more dead from malaria and other tropical diseases. Central to the battle was the F8F Wildcat, designed and built by Grumman, which operated from carriers by the U.S. Navy pilots and from Henderson Field by the Marine Corps pilots throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the sturdy and resilient Wildcat was the principal and most advanced fighter for both the Navy and Marines in the Pacific. Later in World War II, the Wildcats of the Marine Corps operating from Henderson Field were joined by Bell P-39 Airacobras assigned to the U.S. Army Air Forces. Although the Airacobra had success in other theaters and were a vital part of the so-called Cactus Air Force defending Guadalcanal, like the Wildcat, it was outmatched by the faster and more agile Mitsubishi Zero flown by Japanese carrier-based fighter pilots. Both Wildcats and Airacobras were able to hold their own against the Zeros because of their rugged construction and the unique battle tactics developed by the combat aviators who flew them. Ultimately, the success of the U.S. military at Guadalcanal paved the way to other successful Pacific offensives in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Marshall Islands. Of the 7,800 Wildcats produced, nearly 6,000 were built actually by General Motors under the designation FM2, while Grumman concentrated on building the newer F6F Hellcat. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign in World War II, running from 1939 until the defeat of Germany in 1945. As the arsenal of democracy churned out ever-increasing amounts of armament and weapons, German U-boats focused on destroying the ships carrying that cargo from U.S. to the European theater, sinking 3,500 merchant ships, 175 warships during that course of the war. And the Allies focused just as intently on stopping those U-boats from sinking those cargo ships. In the early days of the war, the Germans gained the upper hand and made it very, very difficult for the Allies to stockpile the weapons, munitions, and supplies needed to wage war against the mighty Third Reich. But eventually, Great Britain, Canada, and the U.S. and other allies used surface ships, anti-submarine aircraft, and secret code-breaking programs to protect the merchant ships from making the treacherous transatlantic journey. Britain and the U.S. used a wide variety of aircraft to find and destroy the deadly U-boats, including the four-engine PBY-4 Privateer, or Privateer. A Navy and Coast Guard operated single-tail derivative of the consolidated B-24. The Privateer was used principally as an anti-submarine aircraft beginning in 1943 until the end of the war. Another important Allied tool in the Battle of the Atlantic was the Fairey Firefly, a single-engine carrier-based anti-submarine aircraft used by the British to destroy German U-boats. In the early days of the war, the Allies had decided that the British would conduct nighttime bombing raids on German targets, and the Americans would bomb during daylight hours. The mission losses that occurred beyond the range of fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt were horrific. Without fighter escorts, U.S. bombers in particular suffered unsustainable losses to German fighters. Some estimates put the fatality rate of B-17 and B-24 crews at nearly 50%. That began to change with the introduction of the P-51 Mustang as a long-range fighter. When outfitted with external fuel tanks made of a kind of papier-mâché, a non-strategic material, the Mustang could fly more than 2,000 miles. 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, excellent maneuverability, and aggressive tactics flown by fearless, highly motivated, and highly trained pilots made the P-51 an impressive dogfighter. Some of the young men who flew the Mustang were pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group, the first African-American fighter unit, which provided escort to missions over Italy during 1944 and 1945. Commanded by West Point graduate Colonel Benjamin Davis, the Red Tails, a nickname based on the identification paint on their airplanes, shot down 111 German aircraft. By D-Day, the combined bomber offensive from England and Italy had broken the German Air Force. Without sufficient replacement aircraft, having to ration fuel, and barely able to train replacements for the pilots lost each month, Germany offered less and less resistance to the waves of Allied bombers and fighters flying deeper and deeper into Germany. As we see these Mustangs, and with the red tail on the left, as you see there, I'm reminded that in 1943, Senator and soon-to-be President Harry Truman and his Senate War Investigating Committee said of the P-51 Mustang that it was the most aerodynamic, perfectly pursuit plane in existence. By 1944, the German Air Force was struggling to survive. In a single week that February, the Allies took decisive, strategic steps to ramp up the air war. Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, was a series of large-scale British and U.S. bombing raids on German aviation factories. On several raids, more than 1,000 bombers were sent against targets. Altogether, the Allies dropped over 20 million pounds of ordnance between February 20th and 25th. And the raids were intended to bait German fighters into the air, where nearly 900 P-47 and P-51 fighters engaged them. In less than a week, the German Air Force lost a third of its remaining single-engine fighters and 16% of its pilots. But U.S. forces suffered as well. In more than 3,000 sorties, 247 B-17s were lost, despite the bomber's legendary ability to withstand damage and bring airmen home. That 247 bombers represented 10 times that many in the number of crew members per bomber. Outfitted with up to 13 50 caliber machine guns in 8 different locations on the plane, the B-17 earned its nickname the Flying Fortress, with the ability to fly long distances with a bomb payload of 6,000 pounds. These 4-engine aircraft were the workhorse of America's strategic bombing campaign in Europe. Its crew of 10, flying at altitudes unpressurized, made them wear electric suits to stay warm. They often had frostbite around where their oxygen masks were. But the B-17 pilots and crews fought the fear, the fire, the flak, and the fighters to help win the war. The first Allied soldiers in France on D-Day arrived by parachute just after midnight on June 6, 1944. 13,000 paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions made the trip in more than 800 C-47 transport aircraft. These lead elements jumped into Normandy to secure a series of bridges, causeways, and crossroads, vital to the success of the Allied invasion at France. Memorialized in the television series Band of Brothers, and in the book by the same name written by Stephen Ambrose, the American parachute infantry was still a largely untested concept when they landed behind enemy lines on D-Day. But the aircraft they jumped from was already a proven commodity in 1944. The C-47 began life as the Douglas DC-3, an airplane credited with revolutionizing the airline industry. With the outbreak of hostilities, the plane was reconfigured as a military transport aircraft that performed a wide variety of functions. The C-47s flew in every combat theater, on search and rescue missions, on medical evacuation flights, and on special operations, inserting and recovering sabotage teams behind enemy lines. C-47s flew in every combat theater, and they kept China in the war, flying supplies, fuel, weapons, and personnel from muddy airfields in India across the Himalayan range to bases in China. After D-Day, C-47s supported the Allied drive into Germany, including flying critical resupply missions to surrounded U.S. forces during the Battle of the Bulge. After the 1945 Axis defeat, General Dwight Eisenhower credited 4 weapons with winning the war: the bazooka, the Jeep, the atomic bomb, and, as we see it there, the C-47. Beginning in early 1942, the British introduced a new aircraft to help change the nature of the air war in Europe, the fastest operational aircraft in the world for most of World War II. With a top speed of 365 miles per hour, the twin-engine de Havilland Mosquito fighter bomber was used in many capacities: night fighter, photo reconnaissance, night bomber, pathfinder, target marking, and more. Made largely of wood and nicknamed the Wooden Wonder, the Mosquito's ability to deliver ordnance precisely from low altitude and high speed made it a unique and flexible tool for Great Britain and her allies. They were used in a daring and successful attack on a strategic mine in southern Norway in March of 1943. Because of their high speed and low-level capabilities, Mosquitoes were sometimes used for close air support for ground troops and to skip bombs into critical railway tunnels. On one occasion, Mosquitoes were used to breach the walls of a German prison to allow members of the French underground to escape. By the middle of 1942, as the Allies were beginning to plan and fly missions deep into Germany to bomb strategic targets. Mosquitoes, armed with incendiary bombs and pyrotechnics, flying at high speed and low altitude, were used to mark targets in preparation for larger bombers flying with heavier payloads and at higher altitudes. This Mosquito is one of only 2 flyable de Havilland Mosquitoes in the world today. While we wait for our next part of our program, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the organizations that have helped make this event possible. While we would like to once again thank Linda Hope, the Bob Hope Legacy, and the Bob and Dolores Hope Foundation for their generous support, we are grateful to her and that family and their dedication to this country. Many thanks to the U.S. Department of Defense for the role it played in helping us to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And a number of other organizations provided both financial and in-kind support for our event today, including Bombardier Aviation, Jet Aviation, a division of General Dynamics Company, Garmin, the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, Signature Flight Support, Hartzell Propeller, Federal Express, the Veterans Airlift Command, the George Washington University, and Mach 2 Management. Their support has helped make today's event possible, but we particularly appreciate the role that they have played in recognizing and honoring our World War II veterans. In early September of 1944, 4 Grumman TBM Avengers, operating off the light carrier USS San Jacinto, attacked military installations on the island of Chichijima, approximately 500 miles south of mainland Japan. Piloting one of those 4 Navy aircraft was future U.S. President George H.W. Bush, who was then a 20-year-old Navy lieutenant. Although the mission was successful and the targets were destroyed, all 4 aircraft were subject to intense anti-aircraft fire. During the attack, Bush's aircraft was hit and his engine caught on fire. He flew several miles from the island and ordered his crew of 2 others to put on their parachutes and prepare to bail out. However, both were killed, and the other 3 aircraft were shot down with no survivors. After floating in his inflatable raft for 4 hours, as several Navy fighters circled above to provide overhead protection, he was rescued by the USS Finback, a rescue submarine. Even by the standards of World War II, naval aviation was a dangerous undertaking. Less than 2 months before he was shot down, President Bush and his 2 crewmen survived a forced water landing during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And by the end of 1944, Bush had flown 58 combat missions and received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The Avenger was a torpedo bomber made by both Grumman, its designing company, and General Motors. Nearly 10,000 were manufactured, and they served the U.S. Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Royal New Zealand Air Force. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive campaign of World War II. It began in mid-December of 1944 as a surprise attack on American forces in the Ardennes area of Belgium. Before it was over, the battle would involve more than 500,000 Germans, 600,000 American, and 50,000 British troops. Characterized initially by cold temperatures and overcast skies, the battle demonstrated how thoroughly air support had been integrated into contemporary military operations. The Allies' inability to dominate the skies over the battlefield prolonged the German offensive, and conversely, improving weather conditions and the return of air support helped the Allies achieve victory in the battle. It began on December 16th. With a German attack designed to catch the Allies unaware and to split their forces in half. The Germans wanted to capture Belgium and that harbor at Antwerp. That initial offensive against the unprepared American defenders created an 80-mile wide bulge in the Allied lines. After the Germans' initial success, and as the skies cleared, the C-47 transport aircraft began to resupply ground troops that were running dangerously low on ammunition and airplanes. Improved weather conditions also allowed the Americans to begin supporting ground troops with low-level attacks by single-engine P-47 Thunderbolts, twin-engine A-26 Invaders, like the one that we've seen here. Between the resupply effort and ground support, Allied superiority in the air was the deciding factor in defeating Germany's last-gasp attempt to turn the tide of the war. Not only did the Douglas Invader play an important role in World War II, its speed, ruggedness, and weapons load kept it in service during both the Korean conflict and the Vietnam War, and the last one was retired from U.S. military service in 1972. Immortalized forever by the photo of Marines raising the U.S. flag over Mount Suribachi, the Battle of Iwo Jima helped to rescue 3 airfields and provided the United States with an important staging area for the much-anticipated invasion of the Japanese homeland, as well as an emergency landing field for Japanese-bound bombers and a home base for fighter escorts. It is a testament to the ferocity of the fighting on Iwo Jima that more than 25,000 U.S. Marines were killed or wounded during 35 days of fighting in February of March of 1945, and nearly 19,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, the only battle of the war in which U.S. casualties exceeded the Japanese casualties. Carrier-based chance-fought F-4U Corsair fighters were critical to American success during the battle for Iwo Jima. As originally designed, the pilot was far back in the fuselage of the Corsair, and his view was restricted because of the huge 2,000 horsepower motor, a 13-foot in diameter propeller, and a huge fuel tank, making landings extremely challenging on the pitching deck of a carrier. So early models went to land-based Marine pilots who put the aircraft's speed and heavy armament to effective use in both dogfights and in ground support. Eventually, Corsair pilots shot down 11 Japanese aircraft for every Corsair lost. And by the beginning of 1945, the Marine Corps pilots were flying low-level missions with bombs, rockets, and napalm in support of their fellow Marines on the beaches and in the jungles of small islands throughout the South Pacific, including Iwo Jima. The Japanese called this airplane Whistling Death. From its first flight in 1940 till its last Corsair rolling off the production line and being delivered to the French Air Force in early 1953, the Corsair holds the record for the longest production run of any single-engine, piston-driven fighter. The Corsair was the first U.S. fighter to achieve a flight faster than 400 miles per hour in level flight. Transporting men, weapons, and ammunition and supplies was a critical step in ensuring that the products of our arsenal of democracy reached the people who needed them most. And nowhere was that challenge more difficult than in the China-Burma-India theater. Nicknamed the Hump because pilots had to fly over the Himalaya mountain range, the India to China supply route was longer than any other in the war and was operated for 3.5 years, from the spring of 1942 until the fall of 1945. One of the lesser-known military efforts during World War II, the India to China resupply operations was conducted with repurposed civilian DC-3s from American Airlines, the same airframe as its military brother, the C-47 Dakota. Flying in the Flyover, as we have seen it, is the DC-3, the mostly white U.S. Air Force paint scheme as we hope to see it in just a moment. Although DC-3s and C-47s did most of the heavy lifting in the early days of the war, the Allies were flying a wider variety of aircraft over the Hump by the end of the hostilities in 1945, including the C-46 Commando, the C-87 Liberator Express, and the C-54 Skymaster. During its 3.5 years of operation, this massive airlift effort delivered 650,000 tons of equipment, ammunition, and supplies to the Allied forces fighting the Japanese in China. Over 42 months, the aerial resupply effort from India to China lost nearly 600 aircraft and 1,700 pilots and crew members, a casualty rate that exceeded those of many combat units. The event that we're watching has been 2 full years in the making, and it represents a remarkable collaboration of government agencies with nonprofit organizations and the owners and operators of the aircraft that you're seeing here today. The governmental agencies and government-related organizations that have been part of the planning and execution of today's event have been nothing short of extraordinary, and our heartfelt thanks go out to the Federal Aviation Administration, the Transportation Security Administration, the United States Secret Service, the United States Capitol Police, the National Park Service, and the National Air and Space Museum. Most of the planning for today's event was done by 4 nonprofit organizations, and we would particularly like to recognize the efforts of the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, the Commemorative Air Force, the International Council of Air Shows, and the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. And though it would not be possible to individually recognize every person who has worked on making this event possible, we would like to recognize the one individual who served as ringmaster, cat herder, and cheerleader during the last 2 years. Thank you, Mike Ginter, for coordinating so much of this event from the Air Traffic Control Tower at Washington National Airport. Boss, we salute you. Moving along, the Grumman F8F Bearcat was a smaller, lighter, and faster version of the closest carrier-based fighter cousin, the F6F Hellcat, also built by Grumman. Designed using the lessons learned in combat during the first 3 years of the war in the Pacific, the Bearcat had a better climb rate than any other Navy fighter, an important advantage in a dogfight. Comparatively small and very powerful, the F8F is often praised as one of the best handling piston engine fighters ever built. Manufactured by both Grumman and General Motors, Bearcats were deployed in the spring of 1944 but did not see combat service before the end of the war in the late summer of 1945. Although it was never used in battle during World War II, the design of the F8F represents much of the accumulated knowledge about aerial warfare and aircraft manufacturing generated during World War II. The aircraft's speed, weight, armament, climb rate, range, and maneuverability reflect the lessons learned by naval aviators flying in the intense environment of combat aviation during the earliest days of World War II. Following the war, the Bearcat served as a single-engine carrier-based Navy and Marine Corps fighter for several years, and the Bearcat was also used by the U.S. Navy Blue Angels Flight Demonstration Squadron from 1946 until 1949. Of the 1,200 Bearcats manufactured, the last operational F8F was retired from the South Vietnam Air Force, in 1963. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress carried a bomb load of 10,000 pounds on its 2,000-mile round-trip mission to Japan. At an altitude of 30,000 feet, it was able to fly above most of Japan's home island defenses. Instead of conventional gun turrets, the B-29's defensive weapons were linked through a remote control system that was a marvel in the 1940s. By the time B-29s entered the war, an earlier generation of heavy bombers had leveled much of Germany, so the superfortresses were deployed to China and later to Tinian in the Marianas Islands. The move to the islands put the aircraft within 1,500 miles of Tokyo, well within the bomber's range. With their large numbers and vast payloads, it wasn't long before B-29s had destroyed nearly every military target in Japan. The only aircraft then capable of delivering the first nuclear bombs, modified superfortresses joined their standard comrades on Tinian in the early days of the summer of 1945. And on August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, Boxcar targeted Nagasaki with a plutonium bomb. On August 14th, the Japanese surrendered unconditionally. The surrender formalized a ceremony on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. Over 25 million Americans, British, and Canadians served in the military over the course of World War II. Between September of 1939 and August of 1945, more than 800,000 Americans, Brits, and Canadians paid the ultimate sacrifice, defending freedom. The Missing Man Formation serves to remind us of those who sacrificed their future for that of our nation, and is a tradition which dates back to World War II. Please pay special attention to the symbolic moment when a single aircraft breaks from the four-ship formation and soars skyward, leaving behind his comrades in arms. Ladies and gentlemen, 75 years ago, this month, the world rejoiced. Following the end of the war in Europe just 4 months earlier, at 9 a.m. on the morning of Sunday, September 2nd, 1945, military and civilian representatives from the Empire of Japan gathered on the fantail of the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, to sign the instrument of surrender, officially ending the largest, most expensive, and most destructive war in human history. Every contributor to the arsenal of democracy had done their part, from the servicemen fighting for their countries, to the factory workers and businesses providing those servicemen with the weapons of war that were so vital to their success, to the families who went without so that the boys overseas could have all that they needed. From the shipyards in Belfast and Northern Ireland to the airplane manufacturing factories in Wichita, Kansas, victory was a collaborative effort, a triumph of both military personnel and civilians would be proud of. And 3/4 of a century later, we are no less proud. We would like to thank once again, thank Linda Hope and the Bob Hope Legacy and the Bob and Dolores Hope Foundation for all that they have done to make this tribute possible. And for all those who played an important role in the Allied victory in World War II, whether you were military or civilian, thank you for your service. And for everybody else, we hope you've enjoyed this commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And as we close, I would like to ask you to stick around as we have a very, very special presentation and an interview of one of the last surviving Tuskegee Airmen, Brigadier General Charles McGee, who just last night was interviewed for members of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. Until next time, we thank you. Again, thank you for joining us today. I'm Rob Ryder. So long.
It begins with a spark.
Hey, Jackie, wait for me.
The passion for air and space.
Why don't you take it? You look better on you anyway.
Hey, Jackie, remember her?
That passion can grow. Lighting the way forward for a lifetime. And now, with the monumental transformation of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, this place that has ignited generations of imaginations will be completely reimagined, inside and out. Also, this museum can be even more of what it's always been. A place that gives life to a remarkable past and gives rise to the people who will make history tomorrow. Join us in the mission to transform the National Air and Space Museum. Together, we'll ignite tomorrow.
Before the United States entered the Second World War, the U.S. Army did not permit African Americans to fly in combat aviation roles. Due to significant political and legal pressure exerted by activists and the press, the U.S. government realized the need for change. Despite the Army's resistance, by 1941, the Roosevelt administration and Congress had compelled the military to allow African American combat pilots, eventually known as the Tuskegee Airmen, to fly in racially segregated units. Despite their achievements, the Tuskegee Airmen were not perceived as equals by many of their fellow service members. They had to continually fight against segregationist policies both on and off base, often at risk to their own careers and lives, all while continuing to prove the color of their skin had no bearing on how effectively they could fly and fight for their country. After the war, continued political pressure from activist groups and the press prompted President Truman to order the racial integration of the military in 1948. Despite the progress of serving in integrated units during and after the Korean War, African Americans were often underrepresented throughout the Air Force and were often denied high-profile assignments. Brigadier General Charles McGee's career spanned this entire period, from flying with the Tuskegee Airmen in segregated units during World War II, to piloting an F-4 Phantom in the Vietnam War with a white officer in the back seat, to living to see an African American as Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force in 2020. General McGee has witnessed a sweeping period of massive, if unfinished, transformation. Throughout that time, McGee's career has been exemplary. He flew over 100 combat missions in each of the 3 wars he served in for a total of 409 missions. He shot down a German Focke-Wulf 190 in combat in 1944. He commanded the 16th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron during the Vietnam War. And McGee is highly decorated, earning the Legion of Merit twice and the Distinguished Flying Cross 3 times. In conversation with General McGee this evening is the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Lonnie Bunch. Bunch started his Smithsonian career at the National Air and Space Museum in 1978 and later became the founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. A widely published author, Bunch has written on topics ranging from the black military experience, the American presidency, and all black towns in the American West. we are honored to have Brigadier General McGee and Secretary Bunch as the distinguished guests of the 2020 National Air and Space Society's Flight Jacket Night. Moderating tonight's discussion, please welcome the John and Adrian Mars Director of the National Air and Space Museum, Dr. Ellen Stofan.
Hello, I'm Ellen Stofan, the John and Adrian Mars Director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Thank you for joining us virtually for the National Air and Space Society's annual Vice Admiral Donald D. Engen Flight Jacket Night. This particular event holds special significance to those of us here at the museum. It's named for Don Engen, one of my predecessors, who was the director of the Air and Space Museum in the 1990s. Naming this lecture for him is our way of honoring his commitment to the museum and to our country. Flight Jacket Night is one of the many ways we show our appreciation for our supporters in the National Air and Space Society and beyond, who help us to achieve our goal of inspiring the next generation of innovators and explorers. Your support is so valued. In the more than 20 years since we founded NAS, our members have contributed $21 million to support our mission. And with our transformation of our location in Washington, D.C. underway, that support has never been more important. Thank you also to our friends who've joined us from across the Smithsonian for this event, including members of the Friends of the Smithsonian, the Castle Circle, the James Smithson Society, the Air and Space Legacy Society, the National Museum of African American History and Cultures Membership Society, and the National Museum of the American Indian Membership Society. Welcome to all of you. Get ready to learn what makes the stories we tell here at Air and Space so special. I'm very excited to moderate this conversation tonight. We have two incredible speakers here to share their stories. Thank you to Lonnie Bunch, the Secretary of the Smithsonian, for joining us for this conversation and lending his perspective on the incredible career of tonight's featured speaker. Brigadier General Charles McGee is an inspiration. It is as simple as that. He is a true hero. And did you know that he took a special flight to celebrate his 100th birthday and actually piloted the plane? General McGee has been such a great friend to the National Air and Space Museum for years. From book signings to talks at our family days, he has always been enthusiastic about connecting with our visitors and sharing his experiences as a Tuskegee Airman with others. And we are incredibly grateful that he is here with us tonight to do just that. Before I get started with my questions, a reminder that there will be an audience Q&A later on in the program. So as you listen to General McGee and Secretary Bunch's stories, think of what else you might want to ask. And I'm going to start with a question for General McGee. Going way back to the beginning, what inspired and encouraged you to pursue a career in aviation as your World War II service? Why did you want to fly?
Well, my actual looking back at what took place, the best I can say is I was avoiding the draft. I learned to handle a rifle in ROTC, and Pershing rifles was very pleasant, but had my draft, it's because I was in school, my draft board wasn't pulling my number. Had they pulled my number, I'm pretty sure at that time, it would have been with that rifle on the ground in the mud. It turns out that because of Army policy, that they couldn't use a black pilot because they had no black mechanics. The very first of the now called Tuskegee Airmen were mechanics trained at the technical school, Chanute Field, Rantoul, Illinois. That's how I heard about it. I think probably my ROTC instructor said, well, mechanics are all right and needed, but how about the pilot? I passed the pilot exams, and all I can say is after my first flight down at Tuskegee, Alabama, in a PT-17, I was hooked.
That's amazing. You entered service in the US and then fought in Europe. As an African-American, what was it like being in the Army, an Army Air Force officer in a segregated America? And then what was it like in occupied Italy?
Well, fortunately, we had good training and good leadership. And our goal while we were in Italy was the mission. We weren't concerned, even though segregation went overseas, we were, as I say, well-trained and well-equipped and had the leadership, and Ben Davis Jr., they let us raise second and first lieutenants, as I say, who were anxious to maybe go happy hunting and get a couple of kills so you could maybe become an ace. Our job was to help save American lives, and that we did. So that was what was the focus. It's interesting that when you look at that picture, a lot of Germans were fighting. They were not necessarily fighting for Nazism. Many of them were fighting for country, but that's the happenstance of war and the circumstances.
So what kinds of missions did you fly, and what aircraft were you flying?
Well, it's interesting. And when we look at the Tuskegee experience, there are several phases. And of course, the first is that of the first squadron, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. All of us trained in the P-40, but they're the only ones that flew the P-40 in combat. They went into North Africa, Sicily, and into Italy. It turns out that their first, as I say, the segregation, they went overseas, they weren't wanted and weren't liked. And 33rd Fighter Group commanders, his recommendation is that they be sent to patrol Liberia. Well, how's your map studies from history? Where was Liberia? Where were the Germans? I think you get the idea. But it turns out that when the 332nd Fighter Group combat ready in the P-40, and they say, oh, you are going to do some patrol work. You're going to fly the P-39 Bel Air Cobra. So we switched, still left the States on time in 43, landing in Italy in 44. At the same time, the 99th was moving from Sicily into Italy to the 75th Fighter Group. 332nd Fighter Group arrived. 99th was still flying their P-40 in interdiction and ground support. 332nd Fighter Group was flying P-39 Bel Air Cobra, patrolling Naples Harbor waterways to the Anzio beachhead at the time. But that didn't last very long because the 332nd Fighter Group was one of 4 groups picked to begin the escort work, the need to save American lives. You know, they thought we had enough guns on our B-17s and B-24s to protect them from the German Air Force. That wasn't the case. And of course, bomber completely destroyed, 10 American lives lost. 332nd Fighter Group, we gave the P-39 to the Russians and because it wasn't an interceptor, and picked up P-47 Thunderbolts. Only had the Thunderbolt 2 or 3 months, ended up P-51 Mustang, July of 44, wonderful aircraft. You know, we built the P-51 for the British. They put the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and we said, perfect. And we put it to use. Wonderful aircraft of the day and time. So many, many more missions than P-51.
I even have a pair of shoes commemorating your P-51 kitten from World War II.
I've got them up there. I didn't put them on. So.
What was your time like at Tuskegee? And you talk a little bit about what was it like to be at Tuskegee training before you went over?
Well, it's interesting because the South wasn't a welcome place. Tuskegee, town of Tuskegee wasn't welcome. Fortunately for Tuskegee, then the Institute, now Tuskegee University, that was really our home. And the airfield that was built about 7 miles northwest of Tuskegee. So the sheriff of Tuskegee wasn't a friend, and we stayed out of town. And fortunately, I say they didn't change the training standards. Southeast Training Command treated us well. And those segregated, the focus was what was the mission and not on the segregation. Fortunately for those of us who had not grown up in the South, we had members in the Tuskegee program who were born, raised, and lived in the South, and they let us know where not to go buy gas or what parts of town to avoid. So it all worked out well because the focus was on the mission, not the circumstances.
Yeah. Lonnie, if I can switch to you, what was the path for African Americans to greater military participation during World War II, especially through this story of military aviation?
I think it's important to realize that the Tuskegee Airmen are part of a long tradition of Black involvement in the military. Going back to the U.S. colored troops, the Buffalo Soldiers, but it's the Tuskegee Airmen that really epitomized what this was about. And that was the challenge of fighting in order to get the right to fight. That the Tuskegee Airmen, like many Black military, weren't considered appropriate to fight in the Army. That when they were drafted, many of the African Americans were in service units. They were going to unload things. They were going to be the sort of pick and shovel people. But I think what happened is that there was a great desire by many people in America, especially African Americans, to say, we want to make sure African Americans can participate actively in the war, and especially the Tuskegee Airmen. Because the belief was that if you could fly as fast and fight as well as white troops, then equality would have to follow that. So that the Tuskegee Airmen, in fact, all the military carried a double burden. They carried the burden of being the best they can to fight for their country, but then they also carried the burden of representing a race. And so what you see happen with the Tuskegee Airmen is that there's a lot of pressure that's put on the Roosevelt administration. You see Black newspapers saying, give our boys a chance. You see many groups like the NAACP and others see this as a civil rights moment. And so therefore that puts pressure and begins to open the opportunity for the training in Tuskegee. But clearly, even though the doors were open, it was essential that the Tuskegee Airmen stepped through, that they showed their excellence, and that really allowed other parts of the African American community to also participate in the war.
Yeah, so I guess with the Tuskegee Airmen, I mean, obviously they're incredibly exceptional in their service, but are there a lot more stories around service, you know, in World War II and before that we don't do a good job of telling? And
I think there's a lot, there's a proud history of Black involvement in the military, right? Whether it's talking about the role that African American soldiers played in rescuing Teddy Roosevelt in the Battle of San Juan Hill. But in World War II, what you have are groups like, you've got tank units that really are crucially successful to sort of breaking through the battle through France. You also have things like the Red Ball Express. This is a group of men who drove the trucks to bring supplies so close to the front lines that they risked their lives. You have many, many stories of African Americans who participate in less glamorous ways, but are crucial to the success of the military experience. But clearly, it is the Tuskegee Airmen that in many ways carried the heaviest burden and also opened the greatest doors by their success.
General McGee, what made you stay in the military after World War II? What was it that made you want to continue your service?
That's not an easy question for me to answer because I fell, as I mentioned, after my first flight, I fell in love with flying. I kept good flying assignments, great opportunities. I didn't have, the one thing, you know, they had a preference statement for a period, and my preference, I'd sure like to be stationed on the West Coast sometime. Never happened in 30 years or so. but it was the joy of flying, and I kept getting opportunities that gave me that chance. How and why, I don't think I can put my finger on the actual answer, except that there was somebody said there I was available to fill the need, and it's continued for 30 years. In fact, I actively flew 27 of my 30 years, and that doesn't often happen.
Doesn't. What did you think when you heard about Truman's order in executive order in 1948 desegregating the U.S. armed forces? How did that make you feel, and how did you react to that?
You know, that's good, but it came, first of all, let's say, war ended in 45. The Army never had changed their policy, period. 47, the Air Force separated from the ground forces. And 47 studies said, you know, we need to use people based on training and experience and where needed, not their happenstance of birth. And we're not getting enough money to keep then Lockburn Air Base open and meet our requirements. We need to integrate. The fact that Truman backed that from a national point of view was tremendous. Done coming from the top powers in the country to make a statement like that. And he wasn't very liked for doing it, but he saw the need and the direction that the country should go. And that's what made it so important.
So, and for the audience who aren't totally appreciating this, because we're just getting started here, General McGee's career has covered 3 wars, 409 combat missions, over 6,000 flying hours, over 1,100 combat flying hours. So we have a lot to talk about here. So as the Korean War began, what was different from your experience in World War II, and what was the same?
Well, I got there because when we decided to support the Korean activity, we didn't have jets in place. We had a lot of P-51 pilots. Many had even been grounded. And we had the planes available in Japan. So they grabbed P-51 pilots wherever you were. And I had just gotten into the Philippines, immediately moved from base operations to 44th Fighter Bomber Squadron, and Zappo were in Japan picking up P-51. In fact, my last flight in Europe was in November of 44. January, and what was it? Not January, but August 1950, I'm going down the runway in Japan in a P-51. Had no checkout again, just love of flying. and unfortunately, the training and ability that we've been given. And as I say, again, and as I pass on to young people now, for whatever reason, I just love flying. To be able to get in the air and loop, roll, and spin, come back, put your feet on the ground. What's better? Wonderful experience. And then the other thing that I like to pass on, have the opportunity to, back when it was cheapest, didn't cost so much to fly, and if a plane was in commission and you wanted to get some nighttime, you could go on and do it. Pretty expensive to try to do today. But taking off at sunset and climbing up to 45,000 feet, see the sunset again, see the stars come up overhead, to just, tremendous. And it makes me realize, we human beings are one small aspect in a mighty grand universe.
That we are.
Yes.
Lonnie, can you talk about the African Americans that remained in service after World War II and the types of roles they filled in, this whole integration of the military? How successful was it?
Well, it is important to realize that part of the success of integration was because of the Tuskegee Airmen, because of their success. But integration also occurred really out of both a moral need from Truman's point of view, but also a political need. That you have African Americans moving from the South into the cities, changing the political calculus. So suddenly there were democratic cities that had more African Americans, and that was also part of the calculus of how do we make sure we can keep political power. But I think what's really amazing to me about the Tuskegee Airmen is that the leadership of this really spreads out throughout the country. You've got people like, B.L. Davis Jr., who stays in as a general, General Chappie James, who becomes one of the highest ranking officers in the military. You've got General McGee. You have an awful lot of people who use their time and become influential as role models, as leaders that sort of help the military change, because it didn't change overnight. In fact, you could make an argument that Korea is the first sort of integrated war, and yet there were still few Black officers, and many units were integrated at the large number, but in the small segment, they were still segregated. And it's really not until Vietnam that you see African-American officers leading all kinds of troops and sort of really fulfilling the dream of integration. I think it's also important to recognize that for those who didn't stay in, like Coleman Young or Roscoe Brown, these are men whose careers outside of the military were transforming. Coleman Young is one of the first Black mayors in the United States in Detroit. Roscoe Brown's an educator, becomes a media person that really opens doors for African Americans in New York City. So in some ways, the Tuskegee Airmen are crucially important because what they did was more than integrate the military. What they did was open a door that said the broader society needs to rethink its relationship with African Americans. And that is an ongoing struggle. But the origin of it is in part because of the success of the Tuskegee Airmen, both within the military and those that stepped away.
And one of the things, Lonnie, oh, sorry, go ahead, General McGee.
I was just going to say that's important because there was attitudes that if we get when they here we had our hands on the gun, we'd be fighting white America. That didn't happen, and that was very key at that time. That the focus was supporting our country. You know, the country had come out of 10 years of depression. The job opportunities in the war buildup became available. Segregation didn't change, but opportunities were slowly made available, and the Black Americans participated just as they have in all phases of our country's experience. But that carried forward and allowed what took the civil rights movement in the 60s, again, to change. Progress is not overnight. Things happen slowly, and there's still work to do from that point of view. But I think, fortunately, we had those who didn't change segregation, but believed in the opportunity. And I think that's what the Tuskegee Airmen experience has passed on for all of the young folks for our country's future, believing in the opportunity, not listening to somebody tell you can't do something,
right,
and being willing to step forward and show that you can.
And that so much of what happens during the civil rights movement is often led by military men, African Americans who've come out, Medgar Evers and others who basically tasted some freedom in the military, recognized their own skills as leaders, and brought that back to say that it's time for America to change. And so, in essence, what the Tuskegee Airmen does, what the military experience does, it's a ripple of transformation that opens more opportunities for people who have nothing to do with the military. And in essence, America becomes a profoundly different place because of the success of people like the Tuskegee Airmen.
One of the things our curator, Mike Hankins, recently wrote about the experiences at Freeman Fields and the history of activism. And I was obviously we're in a time where there's a lot of activism happening right now, and I was really impressed to read about the activism that the Tuskegee Airmen took part in to push their case, make sure they could participate, be given that opportunity. And Lonnie, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think what's important is you've got the Tuskegee Airmen, candidly, are very special. They were better educated than many other people in the military. They were officers. Many were college educated. So they were expectations. And even though they understood that America was a segregated land, I wasn't sure they're going to accept that. And one of the best examples is the Freeman Field mutiny. That's called the mutiny, which is where basically Tuskegee Airmen officers realized that they were being told to go to only a segregated officers club. And so many of the Tuskegee Airmen said that's not acceptable. They went in, they were arrested, they were sort of court-martialed. And what was so powerful, though, is that really tens of members, 100 people signed on, a former Tuskegee Airman signed on to say, we're going to support these people who are doing this. So they risked their careers because they knew that was wrong. And what I think is 30 years earlier, that kind of action wouldn't have happened, and it wouldn't have happened successfully. Then as a result of that, the Army has to rethink things, the NAACP is involved, the military is involved, and says, this is not right. And they basically didn't punish many of the men who were involved in this. 3 were court-martialed and 2 were acquitted. So in many ways, these men risked everything to demand for fairness. So they fought for freedom in the air, and they fought for freedom on the ground.
I want to make sure we get to Vietnam before we go to audience questions. So, General McGee, what was it like commanding the 16th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron in Vietnam?
Well, it was a wonderful opportunity for me because, as I say, still enjoying flying and having a mission that was so important. That was tactical intelligence gathering. We carried no weapons. Speed was our defense, day-night operation, and to command the unit doing such an important mission. Again, I was thrilled because I was flying, still flying. but fortunately, performing a task that was so much needed and important to our activity in the Vietnam experience. It started, they needed the action, so they established 2 new tactical intelligence squadrons, 12th and 16th. We all went to school together, got into the RF-4 airplane together. I took the 6th Squadron to Thailand and to Vietnam, and the other lieutenant colonel who went through training took the 12th Squadron to. Well, I was in Vietnam, he was in Thailand. I get it straight. But that's how that came about. But again, an important mission for a country, opportunity for the training successful, another step along the way that you might say helped open doors.
But I mean, you worked incessantly. You were flying missions every 2 to 3 days in addition to commanding the squadron. Why was there such a high level of activity?
Well, certainly there was a question and a lot of questions, and being there in Vietnam, we didn't look at what was going on in Washington and the higher levels, but they're carrying out missions that were required to support our presence there in Vietnam. So it's the nature of military service, if you will.
Lonnie, how does the experience of African-American airmen really change over this long time period and then beyond Vietnam?
I think what's crucial to understand is that the involvement of African-Americans in the military, especially in the Air Force, what you see is for the first time, there are many people who are not African-American who see the African-American creativity, to see African-American leadership. It's also the first time that there are many people, remember, this is an America that's rigidly segregated, even if it's not the law in some parts of the country. So the military is really the first time that you see many Black and white people coming together. So there's a kind of educational part that comes through this. But then also the military has always been, for African Americans, not just a job, it provided a career when many places didn't provide careers. And so as you see that there's been great change, you see the fact that there are more African American officers. But yet, when you look at the number of generals, the numbers are still very small. Even recent studies talk about that when it comes to discipline, court martials and the like, African Americans are treated disproportionately than others. So that in essence, the military isn't perfect, but what it's done is it really has led to a dramatic change in the United States. And so I would always argue, as the military goes, so goes America, because it means that you see people who are then given the chance to lead based on their skill, not based on color. You begin to see a military where people now begin to understand what happens when you come together rather than when you're divided. So it's not perfect on any level. There's still the great tensions that were there in Vietnam and beyond over race. But I think in some ways, it was really one of the few places where people crossed the racial lines to come together.
And for you, Lonnie, as a historian, how does General McGee's story fit into this larger overall story of African Americans in U.S. history?
In some ways, it's about demonstrating that you can do the job in a way that opens the doors for you and for others. And the fact that General McGee was in 3 wars in the military, so long as you outlined what he did, what that did was a model. It helped people believe that change was possible. And within the context of this, there's no doubt that America is a fundamentally different country because of the actions of people like General McGee.
General McGee, after such a long, distinguished military career, how did that long military service and experience shape your point of view and the rest of your life?
Well, as I say, fortunately for me, the fact that I was able to actively fly 27 of my 30 years, I was doing something I enjoyed doing. And that is one of the key things that I pass on to young folks who are our country's future, talking to them, dream your dreams. But among them, hope you put your finger on something you enjoy doing. You don't want to go to work every day but not liking what you're doing because you didn't prepare it. It's a focus that makes it a pleasure to be able to pass on and mentor the youth of today who are country's future. And we need more of that. There are too many youngsters out there not being mentored. And of course, you got to be careful this day how you approach other people, but it's key. Too many youngsters are still out there not being mentored and guided in the right direction. So we can't, if you give up hope, you're lost. So never give up hope.
No, absolutely never. And one thing I've really been amazed by is how the Tuskegee Airmen have spent so much of time post-service sharing your story. Can you talk about how the Tuskegee Airmen have really dedicated themselves to inspiring the next generation?
Well, yes, the National Organization of Tuskegee Airmen, they formed in 1972, but with just 2 purposes: preserve the history that and what it's meant for our country of the Tuskegee experience, and secondly, motivate our youth in aviation space career opportunities, period. Now, some folks had other, you come up and certainly the expansion of education and the programs that they have are all important. But Tuskegee Airmen today are some 50-some chapters around the country, still with that focus: preserve the history, pass it on, but train some youth, giving them the opportunity, mentor the youth in aviation space career opportunities. So it's been a win-win, I might say, one that there's enough in the history to be preserved and passed on. And certainly there are many, many youth out there that need the mentoring. So the path is still good.
Well, I can tell you, having been in the museum, General McGee, when children have come in and they talk to you, the looks on their faces when they're realizing they're encountering a true American hero has been inspiring to me. Watching you inspire them has been inspiring to me. Lonnie, before we go to questions, I wanted to ask you, in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Spirit of Tuskegee, which is a Stearman PT-13D used to train Tuskegee Airmen, it hangs in the museum. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that aircraft and how it came to the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
When we were creating the museum, I knew the story of the Tuskegee Airmen was crucially important. But I also knew that while the story of the military, of their training and of their fighting in Europe, a lot of that was going to be at NASM, I wanted to tell the story of the training. I wanted to give people a sense of the barriers they overcame. And I thought, how do we do this? And then happenstance, we were talking to a young Air Force pilot who had basically purchased a crashed airplane. And as he was going to restore it, he began to do research and looked at the tail numbers. And it turned out to be one of the few planes still extant from PT-13 Stearman that the airmen were trained in Tuskegee. And so he was so excited to learn that story, he began to fly the plane around and meet with other Tuskegee Airmen around the country. And I was like, we need to stop flying and make sure we bring that plane to the Smithsonian. And ultimately, we were able to bring the plane in as one of the most visible markers in the museum of the military experience. And so this was really a way to pay homage to the Tuskegee Airmen, pay homage to Tuskegee, pay homage to trainers like Chief Alfred Anderson, and that in essence, we wanted people to realize that when you look up at that plane, what you're seeing is the possibilities of America if you follow the leadership of people like General McGee.
Awesome. Now we are getting a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to go to the first question that's come in. Is General McGee, what is your favorite aircraft to fly, and did you ever have a favorite plane?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer with technology. Of the early planes, P-51 Mustang, but I always qualify it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Couldn't be beat. Wonderful opportunity, and we were able to perform such an important mission with that. But my active flying, I last flew the F4, but I got a chance to get an F-16 ride. Somebody said, how do you compare the F-16 to F4? I said, you don't. Our youngsters need to understand where technology has taken us. That those are not fair comparisons, if you will, but they need to know what took place earlier, what it meant, what its importance, where are we today, and where are we going tomorrow. Those are the things that our youth need to get from being able to see that plane, talk to folks about it, and then learn their position for our country's future. And that's the way I look at it. It's a lesson step by step. No one is better than the other.
Someone wants to know if you ever escorted the 303rd bomb.
Excellent field and overseas as I had 82 tactical and 54 strategic missions. How many more did we fly, and what days did I fly and what days I didn't? So it's hard to say.
I think he was worried. He was hoping that they treated you well if you did.
Well, fortunately, although segregation went overseas, we were well equipped and well taken care of. So, as I say, all is well that ends well. With the best, certainly another story.
What kind of relationships did the pilots have with the technical crews?
Oh my goodness, key people. I used to fuss with some of the reporters who said, why you always come and talk to we pilots when you ought to talk to some of the mechanics and technicians that make it possible for what we're doing. That's often overlooked, but very key in any activity. The folks that make the equipment and prepare it, those who use it and accomplish the mission, very important relationships, and certainly important to, I'm not sure in my very first few years I realized that, but a point in time came to be very important, and it changes your attitude and relationships for sure with those that you work with.
Someone wants to know, and this is an interesting question, was there ever a time where you felt just really discouraged, you felt like giving up, and why? And I'm going to add to that, why did you keep going? What made you keep going?
Well, I never had a point of discouragement and wanted to change. And as I say, because I love flying, it ended up, I kept getting military assignments and rewarding opportunities. And so I just never looked for something else. Took what came, and it was a tremendous opportunity and experience to enjoy what I was doing, enjoy the assignments that I got, and all of them weren't what I might have asked for. In fact, I think back when we had the preference statement, I said, sure like to be stationed on the West Coast. Never happened in my 30-year career.
General McGee, and this is a question again that, well, this one I think Lonnie and I are going to be very interested in the answer in. To what do you attribute your longevity? You at 100 years old, you're sharper than most people I know who are much younger than you. So what's your secret, and can you let the rest of us know?
Well, I don't have a secret. All I can say is life has been a blessing when it comes. But that's not an easy one to answer. But things I learned along the way that may attribute to some of it. When I was little, you know, you learn to treat other people like you want to be treated. And what's that old saying? That sticks and stones will break my bones, but words won't hurt me any. You didn't let people calling you names or so on determine what you wanted to do. Had the years fortunate to be a Boy Scout. And I say now, if everybody lived by the Scout Oath and the 12 Scout Laws, we'd have a different country for sure. But you know, on my honor, I'll do my best to do my duty to God, country, help other people, keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. And then look at those 12 Scout Laws: trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. Got something to replace that? I think so.
Oh.
Gee, I was a Boy Scout. I don't remember all that. My goodness.
Lonnie, why do you think it's key for the Smithsonian to diversify our own audience?
Part of it is the wonders of the Smithsonian, that the Smithsonian gives you a way to understand who we are as a nation, understand the opportunities of research and exploration and science. So part of it is you want to make sure that you're sharing that with the broadest possible audience. But the truth of the matter is, it's so important because, one, the Smithsonian needs to model the America we expect, an America that's inclusive, an America that understands and embraces differences, America that understands debate, an America that recognizes it's made better by having people who are different, but who are trying to achieve the same goal. And I think for me, what is really important is that we don't have a monopoly on wisdom, but when you bring in more diverse people, you're getting those points of view that allow you to move in directions you could not have anticipated. And the bottom line is, it's also the absolute right thing to do. If we are a country that believes in fairness, then we should show that through the way we are an inclusive workplace that makes sure that everybody gets the opportunity to be the best they can and to recognize that we are all made better when we're standing on the shoulders of a diverse community.
Amen.
General McGee, I have to ask this, do you have a favorite artifact at the National Air and Space Museum?
Well, yes, to be able to stand below a couple of the airplanes you've got hanging there, and whether you start with the Wright brothers or go into some of the war birds, it's a wonderful feeling to be able to realize that they're above your head, or something you can touch has meant so much to the growth of America in that sense, in the military sense, but in the broader aviation sense. And again, these things speak to opportunity. They speak to understanding of where America's been and come from. And there's just so many things like that it's wonderful. Keep expanding. Don't let them go away, because it's so important to the youth that are coming along. And as I say, they are our country's future, and so we need to assure that they get the opportunities to visit the museums, understand the why and the wherefore.
We have a question asking if your experiences have ever been published in a book form or made into a documentary.
I'm not aware of a documentary, but yes, my oldest daughter, a few years back, wrote my biography, and the name of the book is Tuskegee Airmen, Biography of then Colonel Charles McGee. It's in its 5th edition, and it's well, nobody said that's not a book to read. They're still asking for it and wish to pass it on. So fortunately it was done, and hopefully it provides an opportunity for those to read, to understand a little more of the circumstance, the history, and again, to pass on information to our young folks.
I think it's going to need a 6th edition. A question for both of you from our audience. Do you think that mandatory military service might do the country good in terms of understanding other races and ethnicities and increasing empathy? General McGee, why don't we start with you?
I wish we had universal suffrage. I think our country would be better off if everybody graduate from high school, get 2 years of service. Those who want to stay in the military, fine, and those that want to go and do whatever else their direction carries them in the country, I think we'd be much better off. But that's been my feeling, that universal suffrage wouldn't hurt us.
Lonnie, what about you?
You know, I feel very strongly that one of the great strengths of a country is its willingness to commit to serving others. So for me, it's both a 2-year commitment, let's say, to the military, or to a 2-year commitment to working in educational programs in inner cities. I just think the notion of having mandatory service where you put aside yourself to sacrifice for a greater good is really a crucially important thing to do. So whether it's through the military or through these other ways like VISTA, Volunteer Service to America, these are the kind of things I think could make a country better.
I'd like to thank you. I'd expand my interest and take on, because I agree with you. It's very broad and very important.
You know, General McGee, a lot of the times people will ask me this, I'm sure Lonnie gets asked it too. And I think, who were your mentors? Were there people that inspired you in your military service? Because now I'm sure you mentor and inspire others today. But I'm curious who your mentors were.
I didn't try to keep up with them. I'm sure that there were those that working for or with or things that I've learned along the way, but I don't recall. And it just happens. A lot of the history I can repeat and haven't forgotten. Who was it with and some of the names? For some reason, I've never been good at remembering names.
You and me both. You and me both.
So it's so many that I've touched base along the way that have been important to my life, but I couldn't give you the name at this moment if it even meant my life, which is unfortunate, but this has happened that way.
No
you know
worries.
what I'd love to say that the Tuskegee Airmen in many ways were the mentor to me. As Ellen knows, my first job was at the Air and Space Museum, and the person who mentored me was Lou Purnell, who was a Tuskegee Airman and curator. And the very first article, a scholarly article I ever wrote, was about the Tuskegee Airmen. And the Tuskegee Airmen have always been a model for me in terms of not letting obstacles stand in the way, of fighting for the greater good, and of recognizing that if your life doesn't make somebody else's life better, you're not doing your job. So I want to thank you and thank all the Tuskegee Airmen for the way you've transformed the country and the way you've modeled what is the best of America for so many of us.
Yeah, well, you know, it's again the leadership that we had along the way, like B.O. Davis's life experience, if you will, from the time he graduated from West Point, and to others who didn't change segregation, but wanted to assure that the opportunity didn't disappear, that allowed us to participate and take our place in the future of our country as it happened along the way. Very important.
It's very important. Thank you both so much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for tonight. Again, thank you, Brigadier General McGee and Secretary Bulge for this extremely insightful conversation. And thank you to everyone who spent their Friday night with us honoring this incredible aviator's career. Your dedication and support of the Smithsonian goes far beyond any donations. You're the champions for the stories we tell and understand the value that we bring to our visitors from near and far. In the next few days, soon we'll have tonight's program available to all of you on YouTube and on our website. And please share it with those in your life who may need a bit of inspiration, because we certainly had that tonight. And be on the lookout for more virtual programming for the museum soon. Thank you all and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.